My name is Paul Stewart. I'm a GP in Dunfanny and not forgetting the good people of Grainne. And I've been on the board of the Alcohol Forum, as I say, for more years than with Pat, for more years than Pat and I like to mention. So I've been asked to get the ball rolling here. I feel a bit like a bishop in Croke Park throwing the ball in and letting everyone else at it. But I want to just bring a little context to it. And I notice already I'm off to a bad start because it's positive aging and the role of alcohol. So good morning to you all and welcome on this beautiful day. And on behalf of the Alcohol Forum, I'd like to welcome you to the seminar. And a very special welcome to our very distinguished guests who we'll be hearing from shortly. We will hear about relevant policies and procedures in this area, the link between alcohol and cognitive decline, common harms associated with alcohol, direct interventions and screening tools, to mention but a few. And if I can scroll down here. There's a very important bit here that Helen asked me to say, so get it right. And lastly, yes, Helen will be talking about alcohol-related brain injury in older adults. Today we're also launching the alcohol-related brain injury animation. So there's going to be a little film towards the end, which Dr. Helen McMonigal will be introducing later in the morning. Sorry about this. Just, there now. Helen has asked me to thank the Donegal County Council, Healthy Ireland, and the Design Department of LYIT, who helped and supported her with this project. Alcohol misuse in older adults presents unique challenges to families, to communities, and to health professionals. And despite this, evidence suggests that older people do not receive the same level of intervention as younger people. The alcohol-related brain injury animation will provide a unique resource to help increase public and professional awareness of this often unknown and unrecognized condition. Right, you'll be delighted to see I'm not going to have loads of slides with loads of words on them. So to start with, I'd like to provide some context and then a few personal reflections on alcohol in the elderly. We are very good at blaming the young about their harmful drinking patterns, and most health promotional campaigns are levelled at this group. But we often forget that the young have learned how to drink, or how not to drink, from their elders. Harmful drinking in the elderly has been described as the invisible epidemic, or the hidden epidemic, and it's increasing. We know this, but why? We're not sure, but obviously there is increasing availability of alcohol on all our supermarkets and even on the garage forecourts. There is a relative decrease in the cost of alcohol under below cost setting. Being an example, most of us have drink at home and do a lot more drinking at home than our parents did, and there are a lack in Ireland of social alternatives to drinking culture. Loneliness and isolation in old age is also, I think, an important factor. Irish statistics also report that alcohol is responsible for up to 11% of hospital admissions in the elderly, 14% of ED attendances, and 60% of all falls in the elderly, with up to 50% of nursing home admissions related to acquired brain injury, often secondary to alcohol misuse. So these are shocking figures. Older people are less able to cope, both physically and mentally, with alcohol. They have more falls because they have poor they have increasing confusion because of secondary to a general decline in cognitive ability. Harmful alcohol can lead to a vicious spiral of low mood, further drinking, relationship problems, isolation, low mood, and so on, until sometimes it ends in suicide or some unexpected death. Over the last 35 years, in practice, I've noticed a number of harmful drinking patterns developing in the elderly, which weren't necessarily there when I started. One of them is the single man living at home, widowed, separated, lonely and isolated, unable to go to the pub as he used to to socialise because of drink driving and so on, and so drinking heavily at home and regularly. So that's more prevalent now than it used to be. Then I also have come across older women whose children have left home and appear to have lost their role in life, and resulting in them turning to the bottle. And an interesting phenomenon, older men and women whose partners have been heavy drinkers for years, the so-called survivors, who start drinking with their partners to keep them company. A sort of folie à deux. Three or four examples of that. So, I think it's only fair to finish with outlining my personal philosophy, and the same at the Alcohol Forum. As you can see, I like a glass of wine, but I believe in moderate hedonism. A little bit of what you fancy does you good. So I'd just like to finish by saying, if you get a chance to have a look at some of the literature here from the Alcohol Forum, or indeed the website, an excellent website that we have, to see the good work that's going on, that we are supporting. And lastly, excuse me, I'd like to take the opportunity for very special thanks to Helen for organising the seminar and for her excellent groundbreaking work in the whole area of alcohol-related brain injury. Thank you. The game can begin.
Good morning, everybody. You're very welcome here today to the Alcohol Forum event. My name is Siobhan Patton. I'm the CHO1 lead for staff health and wellbeing, and I'm currently providing cover for Cara O'Neill, who's the head of health and wellbeing generally in CHO1 area. I was really pleased to be, thanks very much. I hope I don't electrocute myself now by spilling out on things. I was really pleased to be invited to attend here to chair the session this morning. And just by looking at the programme, it's a really fantastic lineup, starting with Paul, and Sabina's next. And I'll introduce you to each of the speakers before they begin. A few little bits of housekeeping, if you don't mind, before we get started. The usual thing about the phones, if you could have them on silent, that would be super, so that we don't get interrupted by that. If anybody has, in the event of the fire alarm, we meet out there down the stairs, we meet at just parallel to the main road there at the hospital. That's the meeting point. If anybody has access or mobility issues, there are three of us in the room who will help anybody who needs help, who needs assistance in the event of a fire or having to exit the room suddenly. We'll also be having a little stretch break at about 11:15. Now literally, that's staying in our seats and stretching. So we're going to keep going through till 1 o'clock, when there will be a light lunch available. Okay, so I think that's the housekeeping. Is that more or less it, Helen? Yeah, okay, thanks. Now, I suppose I'm really pleased to be here today to talk about the links between the Healthy Ireland CHO1 implementation plan and alcohol. In the Healthy Ireland implementation plan for CHO1, there are 12 targets, and those areas include, one of them is alcohol, the others are positive ageing, some of the others, positive ageing, partnership working, research health intelligence, and self-management of chronic diseases. So there are huge links between the work of the Alcohol Forum and the work of the HSC. The HSC is very pleased to be able to support the excellent work of the Alcohol Forum, and indeed I have worked with them over a number of years in promoting internal staff health and wellbeing initiatives, providing training for our own staff. And in particular, just what I really liked about the theme of this workshop is it's about positive ageing. That we don't see ageing as something that is to be dreaded, but that it's a stage of life that can be fulfilling and happy, so long as we're putting in place the building blocks for a healthy future. The demographics of Donegal are not particularly favourable when it comes to that, because we do have an increasing ageing population, and we have high levels of disadvantage in Donegal in particular. I'm referring to today, 70% of the population is below the national average levels of affluence. Nearly lost my notes there, that would be a disaster. So the aim of today's event is to begin the conversation around alcohol and ageing in Ireland. There is a graph that shows the increasing amount of substances in use, and in particular, I think Helen's research shows the baby boom generation, which is 53 to 71-year-olds. Thankfully, I'm outside that category by 1 year, and that doesn't mean that I'm 72. So that's me, okay. But there are disproportionate numbers who, as Paul has indicated, are experiencing alcohol and substance misuse. We're going to be teasing out the belief that alcohol can be beneficial as we age, and holding that up to the light. And we're going to be highlighting the service response that will need to be in place, which is absolutely key. With any kind of change in patterns, the health service and associated partners need to be able to respond to that. So I'm really looking forward to an informative and productive meeting. I always love being in spaces where I learn something new, and I have no doubt that I will be learning this morning. So my role is going to be to manage the time and to do the introductions and to oversee the little stretch break, if that's okay. Yep. I'm glad we're aligned on that one. And hopefully people will get best value out of the sessions that way. So now it gives me tremendous pleasure to introduce Professor Sabina Brennan. I had a brief chat with Sabina, and I did some Googling in the last few days, and what an impressive person. She's amazing. We discussed what stage of our careers we were at, and we agreed that she's on her third career, her third major batch of career years, and she started in third level at the age of 42. So if that's not positive ageing, then I don't know what is. Studying psychology and having had a successful career as an actor, and having worked in insurance, and also having raised a family, So she's currently the adjunct professor at the Adaptive Centre in Trinity, and she's the principal investigator on e-health. She has also written a wonderful book, 100 Days to a Younger Brain. 100 Days to a Younger Brain. And so, with no further ado, I'll introduce you to Sabina. I haven't touched that water, Sabina, so it's all yours.
I might move it because I probably won't have to. I tend to talk with my hands, so anything that's spillable should be removed. Speaking of, my presentation. I'll let you do that, and while know we've only just met, but I'd like to start by asking you all a personal question. Using a show of hands, I'll answer too, and I'm up here, so all of you get to see my answer. Hands up if you brushed your teeth this morning. Excellent. Now I lied. It's not one question, it's three. Keep your hands up if you intend to brush your teeth again this evening. Excellent. Now, keep your hands up if you consciously, and consciously is the key word here, did something for your brain health today. Well done. There's a few hands up, about 4, I would say, 5, 6. Yeah, sort of not sure. The thing is, you probably did do something, but you didn't consciously do it. But how crazy is that? Like, dental health is super important, right? Because you need your teeth to eat, to speak, and to smile. And actually, it's really important for aging well. Don't underestimate the value of your pearly whites. But you need your brain for everything. There isn't one thing that you can do without your brain. You can't sit upright in that chair. You can't listen to what I'm saying. You can't process or make sense of what I'm saying. You can't make a decision about whether what I'm saying has value or is useful to you. So looking after your brain matters. Brain health matters. Obviously, you were really, really smart kids, because if you think about it, you learned about a really, really complex concept called investment at a very young age. What I mean, you have a 3-year-old. Three, you're teaching kids to brush their teeth. And it is a long-term investment. You learn at that age that time spent now engaging in an activity, brushing your teeth, reaps future benefits. You also learn as you get a little bit older that if you engage in other activities like flossing, visiting your dentist regularly, avoiding sugary drinks, that you'll do even better. And then when you become an adult, you come to realize that even if you fastidiously follow your dentist's advice, it doesn't come with an absolute guarantee, okay? But you do know, when you get to my age, you'll find you'll have a crumbling tooth or two and you need a bit of work. But you do know that you're in a far better position than you would have been if you didn't look after your teeth. Well, the same applies to brain health. We now know that there are things that you can do on a daily basis that will help you to hold on to important functions like memory, attention, planning, decision making, but just like dental health, it doesn't come with an absolute guarantee. You can do all of these things and you can still experience decline in cognitive function, or you may go on to develop a neurodegenerative disease like dementia. But we know that you're in a far better position than you would have been if you hadn't, should have pressed to let it load. I was doing that, I should have known. So that was my little spiel for you. So yeah, so that's the brushing of the teeth bit. So, brain health, why? Your brain is constantly changing, and it's your experiences, your behaviour, the life choices that you make that can shape it at any age, which is really positive. What you do, and actually just as importantly what you don't do, influences how resilient your brain can be in the face of aging, injury, and disease. I like to think about it as that adopting a brain healthy lifestyle is like investing in brain capital. It not only will help you optimize your brain function in the here and now, but it allows you to build reserves that you can cash in at some point in the future to cope with or compensate for disease, damage, or decline. Just to give a little bit of context, brain health matters to everybody. People often said to me actually when my book came out in March, who's the book for? And I said, well, it's for anybody with a brain. I say it's not for you then. But, and it applies, specifically to people with any sort of compromise to their brain function as well. But for the biggest concept and context and concern that a lot of people have is in terms of dementia. So just giving some context on that. Globally, there's 50 million people in Ireland, and in Ireland there's 55,000 people living with dementia. Alzheimer's disease is the most common form of dementia, so there's about 34 million people globally living with Alzheimer's disease. Currently, there's no cure. Like many late life disorders, the determinants stretch right back across the lifespan. So prevention is key. Anything we can do to prevent or minimize risk is kind of the best we have at the moment. And even if we do get some sort of pharmacological intervention, it will be probably similar to something like tackling high cholesterol, where it will be lifestyle changes and a medication combined. It's unlikely that there will be a pill that we'll get to pop that will minimise. Now, some really, really smart people did some analysis and published a paper in the Lancet journal a number of years ago, and they looked at the risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. And they looked at the 7 most common risk factors that are modifiable, because that's what I'm interested in, things that you can change, things that you can do something about. And through complex statistics, they were able to determine that 30% of all cases of Alzheimer's disease are attributable to those 7 modifiable risk factors. So if we could address those risk factors, we could reduce the incidence potentially by a really significant number. Just showing you this for reference. This is slices of a healthy brain and a brain with severe Alzheimer's disease. Obviously it was a healthy brain. This is sliced after post-mortem. But you can see the difference. This is, full and healthy, and this has atrophied. It's shrunk. Now, I want to talk a little bit. I actually hate using those slides but it's kind of all we have. Because to me, this is probably the image of the brain that you're most familiar with. But your brain that's inside your head now doesn't really look like that. That brain looks like that, beige and wrinkly and horrible, because it's been preserved in formaldehyde. Your brain is the most exciting organ that you have. It's vibrant, it's got 86 billion neurons and trillions of connections that communicate with each other and the rest of your body using electrical and chemical signals. It is constantly firing, constantly doing amazing things. It's incredible what you have. This is more reflective of what your brain really is like. This is a fancy sort of MRI image, and it shows, sort of gives a sense of the electrical signaling and the actions that your brain is engaging in. And this is a fabulous, it's a fluorescent dye that's used to colour different types of neurons, which are your brain cells. And so all these little it's like a Monet painting actually. You use some older images. I think it's rather beautiful actually. And I think that gives a much better sense of what your brain really is. And I often wonder, is it that because we see the brain, as that beige wrinkly thing, that we don't see it as something important and valuable, whereas perhaps this gives us a greater sense of that. I used to be really mean when I gave these talks, and I would play a spot the difference game, and then I just started to feel really guilty as people were desperately trying to look for a difference between the images. There's no difference. That's actually the point. Back in 1984, a researcher called Katzman was interested in understanding the difference between an Alzheimer's disease brain and a healthy brain. And he was looking post-mortem at the brains of individuals with a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease in a nursing home. And he had a control group of other individuals in the nursing home who didn't have Alzheimer's disease. And surprise, surprise, he found 10 cases of cognitively normal older people who had Alzheimer's disease pathology in their brain with no symptoms. So that sparked a whole area of research, and that's the area of research that I'm involved in. Somehow they were resilient to the disease. So actually in more recent years we're drawing a distinction between Alzheimer's disease and Alzheimer's dementia. So Alzheimer's disease being the pathology in your brain, and Alzheimer's dementia being the actual symptoms. Something that impairs sometimes your memory function, sometimes your decision making, sometimes your ability to inhibit behaviours, etc. So we call that resilience reserve. Now there's multiple types. There's brain reserve, cognitive reserve, and we talk about brain maintenance, but that's for a whole other talk to go into that detail. But basically this notion of reserve comes from the repeated observation that there's no direct relationship between the degree of pathology in a brain, and whether that's Alzheimer's pathology or whether it's multiple sclerosis pathology, which is much earlier in life, or the degree of brain injury and the clinical manifestation of that disease or injury. There's no direct relationship. So, you know, if someone broke a leg, you would expect all the people who broke the leg to have a similar functional impairment, but that's not the case when it comes to disease or brain injury. The functional impairment is different. So there's something different going on with different people. Two people can have a stroke of the same magnitude. One person can be severely impaired and another not so much. And we call we explain that disjunct with the concept of reserve. Now, your brain, my brain, everybody's brain has the capacity for this resilience, provided you give it a helping hand by living a brain-healthy lifestyle. Basically, we know that, and I'll talk more about it, that there are certain lifestyle factors that contribute to this resilience and reserve, and I will talk about that more in a minute. But the key message really as well to take home for everybody, for all of us and the people that you work with, is decline in cognitive function is not a normal part of aging. Actually, the brain can age quite well. Disease is the cause of most decline, and lifestyle can play a role in minimising the impact that disease has on your functioning. Your brain is plastic, not credit card plastic, but more like Malley, we used to call it Malley putty. And so your brain can change even in late life. Your brain is resilient, that's what I've just been talking about, and so it is possible to build reserves. Also, there are risk and protective factors, so it's both possible and important to look after your brain health. So, to touch briefly on the first one, neuroplasticity, your brain can reorganize itself by forming new connections between the neurons in your brain, between the brain cells. Now that happens at three critical stages of our life. It happens at the beginning of life, when the immature brain organizes itself. So as humans, we're born relative to other mammals, very incomplete. You know, we've a lot of developing to do in those early years. You watch a foal being born or a baby giraffe, and they're walking very, very soon after birth. It takes us up to a year. So there's a lot of new connections have to be formed and developed, and actually that's why it's really critical to be engaging with a developing baby. It's one of my, I can't bear to be, you go out for like a Sunday brunch and people have a toddler in a high chair looking at a screen, and you know, that child needs to be interacting with the people to develop those social skills early on. Anyway, that's again another thing. I told you I digress a little bit. She also told me to be a little bit fluffy on my time. Anyway, I'm afraid of the chair. It also happens in response to a brain injury to compensate for lost functions and to maximise remaining functions. And in fact, if you think back to that individual who had a greater impairment after a stroke, if they're lucky they get to go to a rehabilitation hospital, and that's actually what the occupational therapists and the other therapists will be trying to capitalise on, the brain's natural neuroplasticity. It will be trying to get other undamaged areas of the brain to take over the function of the damaged area. Now somehow the individual who had less symptoms following the stroke, their brain already knows how to do that, and that's probably because they've been challenging their brain across their life, pushing it beyond its limits, so it has had to recruit other areas of the brain to just engage in particular activities. So the brain already knows and how to recruit those areas. That's what we think is going on there. And it happens in adulthood, whenever something new is learned or memorized. I am absolutely passionate about lifelong learning. It is critical to brain health. From that you will get new brain cells, you will get new brain connections, richer, denser brain connections, and brain size matters in the face of a neurodegenerative disease. So the more brain cells, the more connections you can have, the better. And that comes from novelty, learning, doing new things. It doesn't have to be academic. Anything that just puts your brain essentially into that mode, because plasticity is the brain's ability to change with learning. That's the simple definition of what neuroplasticity is. Cognitive reserve.
That's the resilience I talked to you about, that some people seem to be able to remain clinically intact and maintain better brain function even when they have disease. And this resilience is linked to certain lifestyle factors. Key ones are on the screen there: education, engaging in mentally stimulating activities, certain leisure activities, social engagement. You mentioned it there, Paul, as well. It's absolutely critical, and I will talk a little bit more about that. And exercise. Physical exercise is critical for your brain health. So, just going straight in then for the modifiable risk factors when it comes to dementia. Obviously, age is the single biggest risk factor for developing dementia, late onset dementia, as opposed to there is a young onset dementia, but I'm really talking about late onset dementia in this context. People often ask me about the genetics. Yes, there is some familial element, but it's not what we say is neither necessary nor sufficient. So some people who have the genetic element don't develop the disease, and some people who do develop the disease don't have the genetic element. And the research to date would indicate that the lifestyle factors are much greater risk than the genetic element. So you could divide these. First of all, what I've listed is the 7 from that paper. Now, bear in mind that that paper had to limit what it was looking at, you know, in terms of what was available data. So there are more. I've just divided these by cardiovascular, lifestyle behaviours, and psychosocial, but you can kind of split them numbers of different ways. So, type 2 diabetes, midlife high blood pressure, and midlife obesity all increase your risk of developing dementia. Low levels of physical activity, smoking, low levels of education and mental activity, and depression. Now, the 2 other key ones that are significant risk factors for dementia are, surprise, surprise, alcohol, and social isolation and loneliness. So they're very, very critical, and I think what's really interesting, and actually what I see as a positive, is they are all modifiable. They are all things that we can do something about. They are all things that we have a certain element of choice about. And really what I do is about giving people the information to empower them, to start to take responsibility for their own health. I think somewhere along the way, we have abdicated responsibility for our health to people like the health service executive, to governments, to even to our doctors. The first responsibility is with yourself, because nobody cares about yourself. Nobody has to live your life except you, and it's within your power to look after your own health. I'm in the camp that drinking alcohol does not benefit our health. I do understand what Paul was getting at, but based on the science, we used to think that moderative, and certainly the research to a certain point showed that moderate alcohol consumption was protective against dementia and heart disease. And in fact, up to a few years ago, I had slides that said, you know, a glass of red wine, that you know, the data suggests that that's protective. We've got more data since that suggests that that's actually not true. And whilst there is a protective effect in terms of heart disease, particularly for women, the received, how would you put it, sort of knowledge would be that it isn't big enough to outweigh the negative effects of alcohol consumption. Most of you in the room will know that chronic alcohol consumption is associated with cognitive decline. It's also associated with changes in neuronal structure, and it also leads to malnutrition of your brain cells. So if your brain cells aren't getting the right nutrients, they will ultimately die off, and certainly if they're malnourished, they will not be able to function properly. Alcohol use disorders, from a recent French study, which I think Grainne is going to talk more about, associates alcohol as a risk factor for all types of dementia, but very specifically for young onset dementia. I just talk very briefly about the Whitehall study in the UK. It's a very large study, but in this particular aspect of it, 550 men and women were followed for 30 years. It's an observational study. The average age at the start of the study of the participants was around 43. They looked at their weekly drinking, their cognitive performance, and then at the end of the 30 years they took an MRI of their brains. Higher alcohol consumption was associated with increased odds of atrophy of the hippocampus. Now the hippocampus is a very, very small part of your brain, but very, very important. It's shaped like a seahorse, and it is involved in learning and memory. It is also critically the critical area affected by Alzheimer's disease and aging, and also other things like stress. Yes. So higher alcohol consumption is associated with that atrophy of the hippocampus, and it happens in a dose-dependent fashion. So the more you drink, the more damage there is. 30 units a week has the highest risk when compared with people who don't drink alcohol at all. 14 to 21 units a week, which I think is considered moderate, and some governments sort of say that's the sort of, you can't use recommended, but it's on government lists anyway. That's associated with 3 times the odds of damage to the right side, of atrophy of the right side of your hippocampus. 1 to less than 7 units a week, which would be considered light alcohol consumption, is associated with no protective effects over abstinence. So actually, if you look at someone who's drinking light or moderate and compare them to somebody who's not drinking at all, the person who's not drinking will have better cognitive function than the person who is drinking. It's not severe, it's not disease related, but there is that difference. So higher alcohol consumption is associated with faster decline in lexical fluency. So when you can't find words and formulating sentences. I'm going to show a very brief little animation. I use animations. All my information is free online if you want to share them. Grainne.eu has a lot of them, but if you just come to my website, sabinabrennan.ie, you'll find tons of free resources. I'm happy for people to share them, embed them in their websites, etc. But their kind of animation is
what can you do to keep your brain healthy? We all know high cholesterol isn't good for our bodies, along with high blood pressure and being overweight. But what you might not know is that not only can these health concerns shorten the life of your body, they can affect your brain function. The more scientists study our brains, the more they're finding that how well it works is intricately tied to the health of our body. For example, just 30 minutes of aerobic exercise 5 times a week can keep your brain sharp. Because physical exercise not only helps your heart, it can increase the size of your hippocampus, a part of the brain crucial to making memories. But that's not all. Physical exercise generates a chemical called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which acts like fertilizer for the brain, encouraging the growth of neural connections and new brain cells. So, obviously staying active is important, but not just physically active. You need to keep socially active as well, especially as you get older. Because there's growing evidence to suggest that people who can avoid getting lonely reduce their risk of cognitive decline, something we all agree is a good thing. But there's one last thing you need to do to keep your brain healthy. Keep it active. So, in no particular order, here are 3 top ways to keep your brain stimulated. Number 1, challenge yourself. The satisfaction you get from doing things slightly beyond your comfort zone actually changes your brain chemistry, making you feel more positive. Number 2, change yourself. Novelty helps your brain, so it's good to experience new things, take on new situations and meet new people. And number 3, learn something new. This encourages the growth of new brain cells and stimulates the connections between them, which has its own benefits, because stronger brain connections also help keep your brain healthy. So don't let age stop you from doing the things you love. Think young, because if you look after your brain now, keeping it active and engaged, it will make you proud for years to come.
So moving then into my final section, which is what I call brain health hacks, which are just tips for living a brain healthy life. I like to divide them up into activity, lifestyle and attitude. So starting first with activity, get physical. Your brain needs an adequate supply of nutrients and oxygen. In fact, your brain only weighs 2% of your body, but it consumes on average 20% of all the nutrients and oxygen circulating through your body at any point in time. So it's a high energy organ. So physical activity actually has direct benefits on the brain structure and on brain function. Inactivity is associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease, which in turn then are risk factors for dementia. It's not just that when you're engaging in physical activity, your heart rate raises, and that means that more oxygen can be supplied to your brain. But in addition, physical activity also releases hormones. And these particular hormones, I like to talk to them like the ones we were talking about there, BDNF. I refer to them as like the miracle growth for the brain. So basically what they do is they create a nourishing environment in the brain to allow the growth of new neurons. So physical exercise actually helps to stimulate neuroplasticity in the brain through the increase of these growth factors. So it makes the connections in your brain easier for them to grow. Physical activity is associated with better cognitive function. It's associated with increased activity in brain cells that are associated with attention, which is critical also for memory, because attention really is the first step in the memory-making process. It may, as a consequence, then improve day-to-day memory function. But it's also associated with reduced levels of depression, stress, and anxiety, a lot of which would be triggers towards alcohol consumption. So just getting physically active will help address some of the other risk factors. And so it's good for your brain health because it improves your mental health and your sense of well-being. Staying socially active is critical. I could give an entire talk about the importance of loneliness and social isolation. People with more social ties live longer, they've better health, they're less depressed, they're less likely to develop cognitive impairment. Loneliness and Loneliness and social isolation in terms of detriment to health are equivalent to smoking and obesity, and comparable to other risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. Loneliness quite literally is a killer, and I don't have time to go in huge detail on this, but there was a meta-analysis done taking on board 70 studies that involved participation then, of over 3 million people. To take part in this study, to be included in the meta-analysis, studies had to be longitudinal, so there had to be a time 1 and a time 2 measure. The average distance between time 1 and time 2 was 7 years. The participants were adults right across the lifespan, not just older adults. They looked at whether people were lonely, socially isolated, or living alone. The outcome measure was mortality, whether they were alive or dead, at follow-up. And what they found was people who were lonely, socially isolated, or living alone were between 26% and 32% more likely to be dead at follow-up. So there's multiple complex ways in which it impacts on health, but that's kind of beyond what we can talk about today. Just 10 minutes of social interaction can increase brain performance. Engaging socially is a really, really complex activity for your brain. It really has to do a lot of things at once. Aside from just kind of keeping you alive and standing and upright and possibly holding a drink, a coffee, and some canapes, you're thinking about, how do I look? Am I all right? Have I something in my teeth? What's the person saying? Can I remember their name? What am I going to say next? Oh, there's so-and-so over there. It really is a complex, challenging activity, and so it's important to engage in it. And it may deliver better benefits than solving crossword puzzles. And it's rewarding, it makes you feel good. So it really helps maintain brain health and reduce your risk for developing dementia. Go mental, I'm really just talking about learning new things. It does generate new brain cells, it enriches the brain networks, and it also opens up new routes that the brain can use to bypass damage. So if you think again, say, of the stroke victim where part of the brain has been damaged and it will not recover, that part of the brain is damaged and beyond repair. I think, anyone here familiar or old enough to remember Wile E. Coyote, the cartoon, where they would chase each other round a canyon, Mimi, and the coyote would, there was big boulders would fall down, and the coyote would run straight into it and you'd see him go flat and fall back. So I like to use that analogy that that boulder is like a piece of brain damage. It could be a plaque or a tangle or whatever, and you can't get through it. You can't get past it. So you can't find the connection to the word that you're looking for, we'll say, to oversimplify. Now, if you have dense connections, it's like you have many routes to get there. It's not just that single, road there. You can go around and you find other ways and eventually get there. It will take longer, but you'll get there. You have access, and that's why it's important to enrich those connections in your brain. So challenge, novelty learning, I've said already about lifelong learning. It can be anything. Somehow, because we go to school, we associate it with academic stuff and learning, and we have negative feelings about it. But actually, education in the true sense is joyous. Discovering new things, taking on new skills, getting a sense of achievement. That releases dopamine in your brain that makes you feel good, that gives you a reward that often people who have issues around things like drug use and alcohol consumption or gambling addictions are looking for. It's that buzz. It gives you that release, and actually, the more we know that from addiction, the more you get, the more you want, and that can apply positively to the more learning and the more new things you do, the more you want, which is positive for the brain. So it's about acknowledging how the brain works, but switching it to more positive things that give us a real sense of joy and achievement and purpose. Lifestyle, loving your heart, looking after your heart is critical. I don't need to go into details on that. The HSE and all our Healthy Ireland, there's lots of material around how you look after your heart health, but the heart and the brain are inextricably linked. I think it's quite funny that we know so much about heart health, and I would argue that the heart is just a pump that services the brain and the rest of your body, because that's what it does. It pushes the oxygen and nutrients to your brain. If your vessels are blocked, if you've plaques there, if you've high blood pressure, that will interfere with the heart's ability to service the brain, and brain cells can die off as a consequence if they're not being delivered to their oxygen and nutrients. So looking after a healthy heart system is critical for brain health. Choosing balance in life in every aspect. The body thrives on regularity, your brain thrives on regularity. We're very cruel to our brain. We tend not to be very regular in how we eat, how we sleep, what we do things. That makes the brain's job very difficult. It doesn't know when it's going to get the fluids it needs. It doesn't know when it's going to get the nutrients it needs to function. And it is a very difficult job to do, because if you're engaging in a particular activity like picking up your pen to write something, that's a specific area of your brain that is going to need more energy at that particular point in time. So your brain is managing all that, and at the same time has to keep you alive. So it really, balance helps. But also that balance with life, which will also help with things like alcohol misuse. All work and no play is not great, but we don't hear enough about the other. All play and no work is not good either. And that's why I'm not a super fan about retirement, total retirement, and also why something like unemployment is not good. So I would argue that to support people who don't have a job is actually that they should have something that they have to do 3 days a week or whatever to keep them healthy in all aspects. Balance technology with nature and water with alcohol. If you are going to have that glass of wine, alternate it with water. Sleep is absolutely critical. It's critical for memory and learning. It's also critical to insight and ideas. Alcohol impairs sleep. It might get you off to sleep at night, but it will wake you during the night. You may not get the deep sleep that you need to consolidate your memories. Also, sleep is involved in the elimination of toxins. Our body has a lymphatic system, and it constantly clears toxins out of our system throughout the day. The brain doesn't have a lymphatic system per se, so while it clears out some toxins during the day, it cannot be you. It cannot carry out the activities that you do every day and clear the toxins that it creates. Now, I mentioned earlier, it's a high energy organ, which means it has a lot of metabolic waste. So there are a lot of toxins building up every day, and you need your sleep. When you are asleep, your brain works on clearing those toxins out. So if you don't get enough sleep, you wake up feeling groggy, that kind of, toxins in your brain haven't been cleared out. And if you constantly, chronically deprive yourself of sleep, it's not good. There's a relationship between sleep disturbance and Alzheimer's disease. The toxins that are cleared at night, one of them is amyloid, which is also implicated in Alzheimer's disease. So the World Health Organization has declared a sleep loss epidemic, and that is something that we have put on ourselves. I do it too. We deprive ourselves of adequate sleep. It's the quantity and the quality. You need to be getting sufficient non-REM and REM sleep. Get up and go to bed at the same time every day. Your brain doesn't know whether it's a weekend or not. It really is critical. Get physically active, manage stress, create some downtime before bed. We often say, I don't know if I said to myself, I'm going home to chill out and watch Netflix, but actually some research shows that has quite the opposite effect, that actually it increases anxiety levels. And if you think about it, what are you watching on Netflix? Depending on your taste, you could be watching a crime drama, murder series, even if you like romantic films, there usually has to be something dreadful and stressful happens in the middle so that it's resolved in the end. So not saying not to watch them, but maybe not just straight before bed. Caffeine and alcohol close to bedtime, and you can see some of the other ones there on the screen. Attitude is critical. Be present in the moment, and I think that's super in terms of something like wanting alcohol, because being present in the moment can keep you away from negative thoughts. Worrying about the future or being anxious, thinking about the past. We do a lot of our living on autopilot. The brain is superb. It can do that. You can even drive to collect your kids from school and not have any recollection of how you did that. Your brain is superb, but living in the moment is a great antidote to absent-mindedness. Engage in self-talk. Pilots do that. I do it all the time at home. I work at home. I did it this morning. I talk about what I'm doing. It keeps you focused on what you're doing. It will help prevent that thing where you go upstairs into your room, what the hell did I come here for? It's because you've been absent from that. Chronic stress, again, I could give an entire talk about stress, but there's nothing wrong with stress per se. It has survived and evolved because it serves a purpose, a very important purpose. In fact, it's the stress response that will allow us to rise to those challenges that I'm saying we need to keep our brain healthy. You get a kick of cortisol to get you up in the morning time. So stress itself is not bad. It will also save you in that fight or flight situation. What is problematic is poorly managed chronic stress. That impacts on the structure and the function of the hippocampus, which is that part of the brain involved in memory and learning. It impairs memory function. It impairs your ability to learn. You know that even if you're in an acute situation, you can't think. You just know, hold on a second. You just can't make your brain work or concentrate. It also impacts on your immune function and can set the stage for depression and dementia. Essentially, chronic stress actually impairs neurogenesis, which is the growth of new neurons, and it impairs neuroplasticity in the hippocampus. So if you're chronically stressed, you won't get new neurons and you won't get new connections. So actually what you will have is atrophy of your hippocampus. And that's going to affect you functionally in terms of your ability to take in and learn new information, or your memory function more generally. The key is too little stress is really, really bad for you too. Really bad for you because your brain is not being challenged. It also leads to depression and boredom, and maybe people turning to drinking alcohol to make life a little bit more exciting. It's also, one of the issues around retirement and unemployment is not enough stress, not enough excitement in life. Actually, what I say to people sometimes is, close your eyes and think about feeling you get in your gut when you're stressed. Never forget about that, and close your eyes and think about feeling you get in your gut when you're excited. There's zero difference. It's the exact same. It's just the release from your adrenal glands. So flip it over and think about it as excitement. Being active, being socially connected, being positive, being present in the moment, balanced, all the things that I've talked about are great ways to manage stress. And my final tip, which is to keep smiling. It's free. All of my tips actually really are free. They're lifestyle choices. Smiling actually boosts the growth of brain cells in the hippocampus. It makes your brain more resilient. It releases feel-good hormones. It lowers blood pressure. It boosts your immune function. It protects against stress, anxiety, and depression. The simple act of smiling makes you feel happy even if you're not. And that used to bother me as a neuroscientist for a while. How can your brain be fooled by a synthetic smile? So simply doing that has all of those benefits. It releases all of those hormones. And this is the most complex structure in the known universe. And it's fooled by a fake smile. And then I woke up one morning, obviously I'd had a good night's sleep because I got some insight. And I realised it's because your brain is so clever that we can do that. It has given us a natural tool to do all these things for ourselves. Smile. So fake it till you make it. It's absolutely critical. I prescribe smiling 5 times a day. Once first thing in the morning. Great way to start the day. Once last thing at night. Great way to end the day on a positive note. Share at least one smile with somebody else. It, number one, gets you out of the house. It also spreads the health benefits, because if someone smiles at us, it's very hard not to smile back. And it's contagious, and you can do whatever you want with the other 2 smiles. Thank you very much.
Stimulating, interesting, and optimistic. We all know, we're growing in awareness about what the risk factors are, but the fact that so many of them are modifiable, I think is a really tremendously good news story. Now, we will be taking questions for Dr. Stewart, for Professor Brennan, and for Dr. Grainne O'Malley after Grainne's presentation. So next up then is Dr. Grainne O'Malley. She's consultant in geriatric and general internal medicine in Sligo University Hospital. She's a graduate of NUIG. When I was back in the day, it was UCG, but just shows we're of different eras. And she has been working as a consultant in Sligo since 2013 and is the clinical lead for dementia. So she will be able, obviously, to make some really important contributions to the session this morning. So after Grainne's presentation, we can take some questions for the 3 speakers. Okay, thank you.
I suppose the idea is, if you've been paying sufficient attention this morning to Sabina, you won't be coming next year near me. I suppose when I introduce myself and I say I'm a geriatrician, and they're like, I'm that old, I'm like, it's a little bit of a challenging one. There's no way of dressing up geriatrics nicely, but numbers it's an interesting concept. What is geriatrics? What do we have as our inclusion criteria? Who is it? 65? Is it 85? And I suppose that's something that hasn't been quite resolved. In any case, I'm very delighted to be here today and to talk to you, and I suppose it was an interesting one for me to kind of focus and think about alcohol in my own practice. And sometimes we're so busy getting on with, dealing with the diagnosis and counselling the patient and their family and all that. Sometimes we forget about things like alcohol. It's not really something that we kind of focus on enough. So I think this is a great opportunity for me personally, I suppose, in my own practice to think about. So I'm the great privilege of working in Sligo, and like the Northwest here in Letterkenny. It's a fabulous, beautiful place, and but it has its challenges. And in common with Letterkenny, I suppose, in the Northwest we have an older population relative to the rest of the country. So looking at these statistics from 2016 or so, 11% of the population was over 65. This number was higher in our own region, and we in an area that's very dispersed. So delivering healthcare can be challenging. And I suppose in terms of the context that we have an older population, this is particularly marked when we look at patients, we're talking about patients at all over the age of 75, and in the older group of people, there's been a phenomenal increase. And this clearly might be seen as a challenge. I suppose when you're dealing with geriatrics, from my end, I'm dealing with unwell people, and sometimes you might get this notion that it's a negative thing, but it's not at all. People are successfully aging in the community. People are doing very well. When I talk about age and what's geriatrics, we sometimes kind of think that once you hit 65, that's it, you give up now and kind of, you know, stop engaging. And clearly from Sabina's talk, that's clearly not the attitude we need to be taking at all. And the figures bear this out in research. When we talk about people who are unwell and are coming into hospital, they tend to be a frailer cohort of patients. The vast majority of older people are not frail. It's something like 6 to 8% of the population are frail. And I suppose the more practical and pragmatic way of looking at this is that 94% of the population aren't. They are well, they are functioning very well, and they can maintain that. I suppose if we look at the epidemiological studies that have looked at, that often point to this aging as being a very negative thing and talk about things like the Great Tsunami, and it has awful connotations, and that we're going to have a higher proportion of people with dementia. Actually, the rate of increase is nothing like what we're expecting. So people are taking on board what Sabina has been talking about, perhaps more so in terms of things like our blood pressure and cardiovascular health. We need to be doing more about maintaining our brain health in general. So things are very, very positive. But at the same time, we do need to plan ahead for the future. We are dealing with bigger numbers, so there's no point being complacent and putting our head in the sand either. So again, dementia is what I'm going to talk to you about today. So just as a general thing, what dementia is, it's a change in someone's level of cognition, so our thinking, that impacts on your day-to-day functioning. So if you've somebody who might have a learning disability all their life, we can't say that person has dementia. It is a neurodegenerative condition, so there's degeneration in the brain, so that it's a disease state. So it's not a function of aging. Not everybody is going to get dementia. It's important to bear in mind. So people who have dementia, it can be a very devastating condition to have because it really does impact on your functioning. So I suppose the schematic kind of points out the things it does affect people's judgment. And I suppose the big thing people worry about the whole time is memory. But there's lots of other areas that affects in terms of dealing with problem solving, being able to do something simple like, can that person do something like pay bills anymore? So that's kind of one of the things I ask in clinic. Is there a change? And this can be challenging, particularly in older men who are retired. And I think this really kind of, really struck a note with me today when Sabina was talking about retirement being dangerous for the brain. So this older gentleman came into clinic and I said, okay, so what's different in the last 5 years? What's not being done? So that person, the wife has always paid the bills. The wife has always done the cleaning and the washing. The wife has always made the tea. They've never done anything. They've stopped working and they've stopped engaging, and hey presto, they're in clinic with dementia. So, and it's challenging for mine. I have to come up with some really creative ways and think, what's different now? So maybe lost interest in the football. And you really have to go digging to actually say that there is something different. So it really is so important to try and avoid that, because I think it's definitely avoidable. So problems with language. So sometimes when I see somebody and they can't get the words out and they're looking at their partner to try and help along, if they're putting things in inappropriate places, and this can be very, very distressing. So for example, somebody who is accusing their family members of stealing things because they have to make sense of what's going on around them. So kind of, naturally somebody's stolen it. There's that lacking of insight. Difficulties doing familiar tasks, changes in personality, and this can be devastating to deal with. You've somebody you've lived with all their life, and it's just so frustrating. And sometimes people, I think, come to me, particularly relatives, and say, don't tell mommy she has dementia. Don't say that. But it's the not knowing and the not making sense of the world that is so much, that can be so destructive. So, sometimes the what ifs and the maybes are actually much more devastating than the realities of what you're dealing with. And I often find that people really benefit from knowing their diagnosis. the disorientation in time and place and change in mood and behaviour. And these, and there's lots of issues within those symptoms that can be modified, that can be helped. It needs a team approach, so we work very closely with our old age psychiatry colleagues, and we can absolutely benefit from making a difference in patients who have dementia. So, I suppose we're talking today about alcohol, and again, this is it's a good thing to reflect on. When I see somebody, I suppose, and I'm mostly thinking about dementia, it's when I see somebody in outpatients, and we want to make sense of the world. We want to make it easy for ourselves. You have X diagnosis or you have Y diagnosis. We give you this drug, we do that. This is what you're going to expect. But it's not always that straightforward. We like things to be nice and neat, but life isn't like that. So, for example, Alzheimer's dementia is felt to be the most common cause of dementia. There's a particular pattern we might expect to see if somebody has Alzheimer's dementia. There's particular drugs we might use, but not everybody, as Sabina beautifully demonstrated earlier on, who has the disease on the brain will have the pathology. There might be an element of vascular dementia as well. It's not always easy to figure out which one it is. And I think sometimes that what often happens in that is that we want to keep things nice and neatly focused on one diagnosis. There's the huge potential of missing other things. And I think in particular there's a great tendency to miss alcohol. We forget to talk about alcohol in older people, and I suppose it's kind of something that we're not geared towards, that we need to think about a lot more. So why is dementia important? Well, the numbers speak for themselves. There's 4,000 cases in Ireland every year, so even though the numbers aren't going up to the same extent, the numbers are going to increase as a reflection of our demographics. So there's 55,000 people this year, and that's going to go up to 113,000 in the not too distant future. A huge number of people in this country are carers, and again, that's a very can be very, very challenging. And a lot of the times that I see people coming into hospital who are admitted under my care with dementia, it's not really the patient that has the problem, it's the carer. It's the person who's been up all night and is just absolutely burnt out, and really, it's a whole other talk by itself. But how we manage that, really, there's a huge scope for improvement, because when we're dealing with a younger person, you deal with that person. Often you can think of it as a single entity, but when you're dealing with an older person, you also have to mind that person's family as well, and that's something we need to be very cognizant in terms of planning our services. So what I'm going to touch on for the next little while is a little bit of repetition here. A little bit about how alcohol excess affects the brain, and then I'm going to talk a little about alcohol and dementia, because they're kind of slightly different constructs. So, I suppose the epidemiological evidence is that older people do drink less than younger populations. I'm not too sure how the US study is, but apparently 11% under 50, and then people drink a little bit less as they get older. But do we look for it in older people, and are the tools we have any good for that? So, for example, a lot of you might be familiar with the CAGE questionnaires. You cut down, do you get annoyed, do you feel guilty, do you need an eye opener? It may not be that relevant to older people. It may not pick up on problematic drinking in that age group. So older people may drink as a social outlet. They drink because they have time and they don't have other things to fill that time, particularly when they're retired. And I suppose the other thing we need to think about as well is accidents caused by drinking, and that we don't always look for. So if we look for it in a more, if we actually look for alcohol excess in a more standardised approach, so if you ask people to drink, they may not volunteer it as much, but if a formal questionnaire is given, so people may not be aware that they're drinking in a problematic way, a significantly higher number of people do have issues with their alcohol intake. When we're dealing with drinking in older persons, there's also an additional complexity around frailty. So what is frailty? So you can have 75-year-olds who are running marathons, and you have 75-year-olds who come into hospital to me because they're a little bit dehydrated. So age is a very arbitrary way of dividing up how services should run. It really doesn't work that well. Frailty is a much more useful way of deciding who needs to have comprehensive geriatric assessment, who needs the full bells and whistles of our occupational therapy department, our physiotherapists, etc. The problem is we don't have a blood test for frailty. We don't have a radiological diagnosis. But what we do find is if that person who is frail comes up against any kind of a stressor, so things they could have dealt with very nicely when they were in their 30s or 40s, like pneumonia, or if they fall related to alcohol, then suddenly they end up in hospital with a hip fracture. That's how I know that person is frail. But it's more kind of, it's a measure of reserves. We don't know how to measure that quite yet, but it's definitely, I think, something that there's a lot of research in. So alcohol excess in an older person it causes, I suppose, all age groups really, but particularly an older person is more likely to cause more physical, psychological, and also causes social problems. And I suppose the other problem is that frail older adults present atypically. So if somebody comes in to me who has had a fall related to alcohol, their presenting complaint may be that they're confused or they're newly incontinent, and all these geriatric giants. And if they've fallen down, they're probably a bit dehydrated by the time they come to me and have pneumonia. And there's so much, and their blood pressure's all over the place, and they're really agitated, and everybody is so taken up with managing all those medical issues that we get so sidetracked into dealing with the crisis at the moment. It's like, well, why did they fall in the first place? What were they drinking? Are they going to volunteer that? And not infrequently there's been scenarios where I've dealt with a situation like that, and then, we fixed the fracture and we sorted out the pneumonia, and we've given ourselves a pat on the back, we've got the patient beautifully packaged up by the multidisciplinary team, and then the family will take the patient home. Okay, what's going on now? And it transpires that there's been an alcohol problem on that person's life. So the most recent case I was dealing with, the whole family were not involved anymore because there's alcohol issues all the way along. So when there's issues now, we don't know, is it alcohol withdrawal, is it delirium, is it something else? And alcohol is the reason that patient is in hospital and now not leaving hospital. So it can be very, very tricky to kind of, number one, get through all the medical stuff, but in an older person then you have to deal with all the psychological and social issues as well. Clearly in the research that has been done, alcohol does have huge implications for our healthcare. So 14% of emergency department referrals are medical inpatients, and 18%, and it has a huge burden in terms of psychiatric presentations as well. And I suppose that's always a scenario, is the person having a depressive episode because they're drinking, or drinking because they're depressed. It's really, really difficult to tease that out sometimes. But the challenges are the comorbidities, so patients often have many, many other medical problems on top of all that, and then they present in an atypical fashion. There's a similarity between alcohol excess, depression, dementia, and insomnia. So sometimes kind of maybe miss out on alcohol as another element there as well. So if somebody comes into me in their 80s, and I must admit I wouldn't normally be my mindset wouldn't be to refer that person to addiction services, but maybe I should, and maybe this is something that's highlighted to me that we should be doing. So if it's a younger person, we normally give them a phone number and off they go, but is that person, how are they going to get to that service? If they're incontinent, who's going to deal with it? Who's going to help them with the lifting? Is there issues around this cognitive impairment, how well they're going to engage? Just because that person is old doesn't mean we need to be very realistic about it and not engage with that service at all. There's obviously more challenges, but in this age group there always are, and that doesn't mean we just give up. And I suppose the other thing is that there's social myths that it's probably a positive thing that people, what else would they be doing, have a drink, enjoy it, but that maybe that it's okay at this stage, and that's clearly not the case. So what is the standard drink? Most of us don't know. So even in the Irish context, a HRB study in 2012 showed that maybe 20% of people had an idea of what we should and shouldn't drinking. So most of us don't really know. So as it happens, I think there's US data that shows that women should drink less than 1 drink a day, or no more than 3 drinks on a single day, no more than 7 a week. Men, a little bit looser, and then there's separate recommendations for people over the age of 65. So this is US data, but what is standard? what, who's pouring it, what's a generous glass of wine. So, if we're comparing international data, if we're looking at guidelines from different places, we may not be talking about the same thing. So somebody's standard in the US might be different to Japan, might be different to the UK. So it's really important to bear that in mind. So clearly, alcohol is toxic for the brain, and particularly, there's evidence from neuropsychological studies and radiological studies that excess alcohol does cause brain damage. But on a positive note, people who do stop drinking, there is evidence that the brain does change. So the damage that has been caused by alcohol can be reversible. So why does alcohol damage the brain? So there's a number of different factors. So it can be neurotoxic. There's the nutritional element. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Wernicke's and Korsakoff's encephalopathy. Alcohol is a risk factor for other organ problems. So for example, the liver, it increases the risk of epilepsy, and all these scenarios are very toxic for the brain. And it's also associated with vascular risk factors such as high blood pressure or atrial fibrillation, which is an irregular heartbeat, and significantly increases people's risk of stroke. And also associated risk factors such as smoking and low educational attainment. Not always, in terms of education and alcohol, but we'll talk about that later. So Wernicke's encephalopathy is an emergency we try and avoid. So anytime anybody comes into the emergency department, if there's any hint of alcohol, we hook them up with this absolutely noxious looking thing, but it's really, really important for them, called Habernicks. And they get lots and lots of that, and it's given really, really, some people are very, very kind of good at trying to give, to try and prevent this from happening. So if that doesn't happen, there's a risk of that person, if they have a B1 deficiency, of developing encephalopathy. So they have changes in their level of consciousness, they have problems with their eye movement, so ocular motor dysfunction, and they become very unsteady. And this can happen in other scenarios where people are malnourished, and if it's untreated, it can progress to Korsakoff psychosis. So this is called confabulatory psychosis. So for example, it's called confabulatory because people apparently make up what they think is going on. So you ask them, have I met you before? And they'll say yes. And so it's called that, but actually that's only very present in the very early stages of this condition. It tends not to be present later on. And in terms of psychosis, they don't tend to have hallucinations or anything like that. But what they do have is very significant memory loss. So particularly very huge problems with short-term memory. So I might tell the person there is, as usually the case in Sligo, not Sligo obviously, but, and we keep repeating that, and it just will not register, or they're not able to keep that information. So clearly it's very difficult to function, and a lot of people who have Korsakoff psychosis end up spending significant periods in residential care where they're work with the MDT and they're nourished, and oftentimes they do manage to get home. But I don't know, when I'm seeing the gentleman I seen on a consult yesterday to think about what we're going to do with this gentleman's Korsakoff psychosis, is he going to be that person who's going to go home at the end of it or not? So it's not a straightforward scenario. If I'm not too sure if that person has Korsakoff psychosis or not, I can do an MRI scan, and the area of the brain that's affected is the thalamus. That's important for memory. You can see very characteristic changes there, and in the lower area there's I should have pointed, but anyway I don't. The memory body there is characteristic for changes in Korsakoff psychosis. Another area that often happens that's affected in the brain by alcohol is cerebellar syndrome. So again, people who have this typically can be very disabled by problems with their walking. So really, the back of your brain is really, really important for walking. And it's the same neuropathology, so the same problems that you have in Wernicke's, it's just a different part of the brain. So if it happens in your thalamus, just kind of more in the middle of your brain, your memory is affected. If you get this pathology at the back of your brain, your walking is affected. And again, it's, the similar kind of scenario. If somebody has this, I don't know if that person is going to recover or not. So it's nutrition, MDT, and hope for the best. So clearly, if you drink too much alcohol, it's not good for your brain. You could have a Wernicke's encephalopathy, cortical psychosis, cerebellar damage. Like, there's very, very clear evidence that alcohol is related to these. However, alcohol and dementia, then it gets a little bit more woolly. Most studies focus on potential consumption to reduce the risk of dementia. There's apparently better outcomes with moderate consumption versus heavy or non-alcohol consumption, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a few minutes. With their cohort studies, there's various, what's the standard in Japan versus standard in Great Britain, and so we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Sabina was also talking about this fabulous paper that's in the Lancet 2 years ago, which really brought together a lot of information about dementia in terms of prevention, treatment, management. It was just a fantastic paper. And I suppose one of the things that really, really focused on is, can we prevent dementia? And I suppose there's no cure for dementia, that we don't have yet the disease-modifying agent that we can say, this is the person given this disease, that this treatment, it won't happen. But if we can delay the onset of dementia by 5 years, the evidence would be that we can reduce the prevalence and the cost by about 40%. So if we do all those things like exercise, blood pressure, social engagement, we can reduce it. We can reduce that onset, and it has huge implications for everybody, to avoid patients, avoid people being kind of coming to clinics, for the families. It has, and for, I suppose, our health budget is another day's work. But interestingly, alcohol wasn't included in this, and because there is that little bit of ambiguity around the research for alcohol. So what I'm trying to do is try and get a clearer picture in our head about why we need to be much more cognizant about dementia and alcohol. So, following that study in the Lancet, there was a large retrospective cohort of 30 million people that looked at alcohol use and its relation to dementia. Now, it would be fabulous if we could do what would be the best way of proving anything in medicine, which is a placebo, blinded, randomized controlled trial where we kind of take a couple of million people here and we give them X amount of alcohol, and a couple of million here we give them something that is a placebo that's like alcohol, and see how they go through and control for everything. That is never going to happen. So we have to kind of, we're never going to have that level of data, so this is the next best thing. So this is French hospital data that looked at discharges. It was pretty comprehensive because all public and private claims were involved in it. Alcohol excess was identified by mental and alcohol behaviour disorder due to former or chronic alcohol use. Chronic conditions that are related to alcohol was labelled like alcoholic liver disease, or other conditions where it's purely an alcohol input as well, such as alcoholic cirrhosis or Wernicke's. Other risk factors were looked at, like depression and hearing. Postal codes were used as a proxy for education, and it also looked at other conditions such as sight loss and sleep apnea that might be factors. So they divided the groups into men and women. So women are on top there and men on the bottom. And the reason they did that was because there was a lot more risk factors in men. So for example, the red area there is alcohol-related brain damage. So you can see that it's the sliver for the women, much more prominent for the men. And the AUD, I have to keep reminding myself what that is because it's not a term we use so much here, alcohol use disorders, was also much more common in men versus women. So this is a very complicated table, so I'm not going to go into any of it, just to kind of give you just a flavour of the data that they had in the study if you want to look it up. So they looked at all the different, they did some statistical analysis on this, and they looked at all the risk factors that might be that's what people who were diagnosed with dementia. So for example, in the study, there was, of the 30 million people, 4.2% were diagnosed with dementia. I can't remember the exact number.
It's about 1 million, I think.
Very good. So, and we can see that when we look at the different risk factors, and they kind of looked at all the things like cardiovascular risk factors and things like hearing, and that the most important determinant in both men and women of whether that person was going to develop dementia was alcohol. So this was, when we look at other things, then like whether they hearing, cardiovascular risk factors, etc. So there was a marked association between alcohol use and all types of dementia. This relative risk was more than 3. So compared to cardiovascular, I think for hemorrhagic stroke was maybe 1.8. So there was a really, really significant association between alcohol and dementia, and it's particularly high in those who have young onset dementia. So I suppose the French healthcare system is pretty different to our own. There's very universal and liberal access to it, so a lot was a huge, a very representative proportion of the population. There's a risk of bias here because hospitals are reimbursed on diagnosis. They might have overstated the dementia end of it. And the other problem is that we can't for sure say somebody has dementia without a biopsy and it can be a little bit, but we can't be 100% sure about the diagnosis. But I suppose the other thing to bear in mind that there might have been an underestimation of alcohol, but it's clearly alcohol use disorder is a huge risk factor for dementia. So thinking back to those studies that might suggest there is some benefit. So I know that alcohol is very, very damaging. I see it every day in my practice, particularly when I'm doing my post-Cold War round, and you know, it really is striking how much of that is alcohol related, and that's when it's obvious. Sometimes we don't dig enough and look for it, but even at that, it's very clear there's a huge amount of alcohol. So that's the acute end of it. When I'm sitting in my outpatient clinic and it's a bit calmer and somebody's coming in, do I suggest that person should have a glass of wine as a good thing in terms of if they have mild memory problems? So we're looking at a J-shaped curve, and so for example, you know, if there's we're looking at J-shaped, a certain amount of something is good, nothing of it is bad, and then more of it is too much. So that's kind of what we're looking at in terms of there is mortality benefits apparently for reduced amount of alcohol. There's a lot of studies that have looked at alcohol and the risk of dementia, and it's postulated that moderate alcohol intake versus too much or none is beneficial, and that it may have a favourable effect on lipids, may have an anti-inflammatory effect, so all these things are positive for our brains, maybe antithrombotic, so less strokes. So that's what the meta-analysis of the data look at, but they're observational studies. So they either are looking either being short studies where they kind of look at something like somebody's lipids, but it doesn't look at alcohol and dementia per se, or else it's looking at lots of people over a period of time, and we don't know, for example, how good that data is. So there's no randomized controlled trials basically. So if we're looking at abstainers, so we're kind of talking about a scenario where you're better off if you're a moderate drinker versus a non-drinker. The problem with that is that when we're comparing moderate drinkers with no drinkers, there's more to the scenario than just alcohol. So they're not going to say like, these are completely similar groups of people. These are drinkers, these are non-drinkers. The non-drinkers have different characteristics that we need to bear in mind as well. So a lot of people stop drinking when they're ill. A lot of people who are in the abstinence group are former alcoholics. Abstention from alcohol could be a sign of underlying emotional or other physical issues. So for example, there's a study in the Lancet in the late 90s that looked at nearly 10,000 men and women in their 30s, and the people who abstained completely from alcohol, and they weren't alcoholics per se, were more likely to have other psychological or other illnesses. And maybe that moderate alcohol may indicate a resistance to alcoholism, and there's also the likelihood there's inaccuracies in what's reported for alcohol use. So in these studies, alcohol is generally self-reported and it's one-off reading, so how accurate that is questionable. As we said earlier on, there's lack of standardisation as to what alcohol is. So if we're talking about different countries, even within the EU, there's a difference in what we kind of might see as our standard. There's this inconsistent or no control for compounding variables, and things like smoking may not always be addressed. Another confounding variable is lifestyle factors. So, for example, if you're in the United States, There is people who have a higher socioeconomic group are more likely to be moderate drinkers, and people of a lower socioeconomic group are more likely to not drink at all. So, people who have a higher socioeconomic group are more likely to avail of health screening, they're more likely to have access to healthcare in general, so clearly they're going to do better in that regard, more likely to have higher education status as well. So all these things are protective against dementia. So where does that leave us? Where does that leave me? I suppose I'm kind of coming at it from a scenario where I'm dealing with my patients, and our patients particularly, people who have mild memory problems. So what we do know is that alcohol use and alcohol use disorder are associated with problems with brain structure and cognitive dysfunction. So alcohol damages the brain basically. And we have very good data now that shows that from a public health perspective, we really need to think about thinking of alcohol as a really important risk factor for reducing dementia levels from, as opposed from a public health perspective. From a patient perspective, when I'm dealing with my patient, I cannot say that there is an absolute benefit of alcohol consumption is unclear. We have no randomised controlled trials on this, and as I've kind of outlined there, the trials we do have are the quality of that data is very questionable, and there's a lack of agreement about what is a safe level. So that's it. So thank you very much for your attention.
We are now going to take 3 questions from the 3 speakers, from Dr. Stewart, from Dr. Sabina, Brennan, and from Grainne. So, I'm going to throw it open to the floor. Paul, you have a question?
Can I ask a question? I'm a bit depressed by all this. I like a glass of wine. I don't think I'm going to enjoy it as much as I used to. My question is this: there sort of seems to be 2 sides to this. One is that brains don't degenerate unless if they're not looked after. If they're looked after, they don't degenerate. If they're not, they do. And then I understand that geriatricians understand that there is a slow decline in the aging process, which happens. So where am I? For instance, to take an example, it's unusual for men to get up in the middle of the night for a pee until they get to a certain age, and then it's quite acceptable for them to get up maybe once a night for a pee. So, is that right? And so there is a decline of some sort.
Not necessarily. I think most patients, I'm seeing, I suppose, from my day-to-day business, I'm dealing with people who come in unwell or in a crisis or who have an issue. Most people are well. And I think really one of the issues I think we have with how we manage our health system is we deal with crisis very well. There's less of a focus on preventing problems. And I think that Sabina's talk is probably, I would think, is probably the more relevant here today. Most people are well. Most people can stay well. Clearly, we're always going to have a subset of the population who are going to run into problems, who will need to come into hospital. I think
but as we're older, do we not get some degree of cognitive impairment?
Well, your peak's at 15, so I mean, if you think about it in that regard, you're on. I mean, that's not true. You kind of make up for that by having more wisdom and having more, lots of other things.
The answer is it's somewhat complex, but it's also really, really interesting and I think quite positive. So in terms of structure, if we divide structure and functioning, so in terms of brain structure, the brain atrophies by about 2% every 10 years from the age of 30, right? You have to remember we're aging from birth, so from the age of 30, the brain shrinks by about 0.2%. And that rate of shrinking accelerates when you hit 65, and then is even much more rapid if you have a disease like Alzheimer's disease. So we're talking about your brain shrinking in size, and the less brain you have, that's going to impact on how your brain functions. Now, the interesting thing when you think about this is, and this is where brain maintenance comes in that I didn't touch on in this talk, is we used to think that was just aging per se, just you lose it as you go on. But if you think about this, we now know it's possible actually to keep pace with that rate of decline. You can maintain your brain size. I actually write about it in detail in my book because I actually think it's really important. So you can maintain that size by engaging in a brain healthy life. Getting those neurons, those connections. So size matters actually when it comes to your brain, and bigger is better. The thing is, if you think about it, what changes from the age of 30? Up to the age of 30, you're playing sports, you're engaging in physical activity, you're being social at school every day, at work, you're in education, you're stimulating your brain, you're learning new things. When you leave university, you're in work, learning a new job, you're challenging things. From the age of 30 onwards, you start to be able to do a lot of those activities without the same challenge and stress on your brain, which I see as a positive. So, you know, that actually, so it's use it or lose it. So your brain, because it's such a high energy consumer, it can't waste energy on brain cells that aren't being used, because it just doesn't, it's not efficient. So really use it or lose it is key. So if you actually very consciously challenge your brain, you know, are physically active, do all those things, you can have a plumper, healthier brain, and it's possible to maintain that size. When it comes to functioning, as I said earlier, the brain can function quite well till the end of life, and I'm glad you made that point as well about the 6% of people being frail. We tend to focus on the negative. What does happen, we don't get away scot-free in terms of our functioning. We definitely see a slowing in processing speed, right? Pretty much the same as we see a slowing in our physical speed. You can't run as fast as you can, it takes longer to cross the road. So it actually takes us a little bit longer to process information when we get older. It takes us a bit longer to find the right word. Now, unfortunately, because we live in an ageist society, we tend to stress about that and go, oh, I can't find the word, or catastrophize and think you're losing your memory or something like that, when actually you just need a little bit more time. Now, you've no problem allowing yourself or expecting others to allow you take more time to get up off a sofa or cross the road. We just need to allow ourselves that little bit more time to access information and to get others to allow us, so that we don't throw stress into the mix, which actually makes it even harder to find the information. The thing is, what the research shows is that while we get slower with age, our responses are just as accurate as they were when we were younger. So our accuracy, so that does change. We do expect to experience a certain decline in terms of memory, the ability to form new memories. But some of what we classify as failures of memory are actually more likely to be failures of attention, absent-minded. We become more absent-minded actually as we get older. And we also find it more difficult, it's kind of akin to what happens with hearing. We find it more difficult to filter out unimportant information. So that's key to attention, you know? So some of the tips I give other talks about how to support changes, even if you have a diagnosis or mild cognitive impairment or dementia, or even like a cognitive impairment that associates with multiple sclerosis, is to actually cut out those distractors. You know, turn off the radio, look at your decor even if you're in your house. Is it all really, really busy and cluttered? Because that kind of can be impairing it. So overall, the brain does quite well. And I do think a huge amount of it, what we associate with aging, is actually to do with how we change our lifestyle as we go over. I use the analogy, I talk about it in terms of muscles too. Now, your brain is not a muscle, but we tend to think that muscles atrophy with age. They atrophy with disuse. We stop using them. And then at Google, there's tons of people to Google online. Their names are escaping me, but they will come to me at some point. But you Google them. There's an amazing woman, she's online, she's 86, she has an 8-pack, let alone a 6-pack. She's the world, weightlifting champion. There's another fabulous man who wrote a book, Age is Just a Number. He was a dentist. When he retired, he took up, and I can't remember the order in which he took them up, but he took up running and he took up weightlifting. He again also ripped, after having let them atrophy, he could get them again. And he became world champion in his field in both weightlifting and running. So it's the equivalent in a sense. The healthier you are, if you're engaging in those activities, you can keep healthy, and I think the same applies to the brain.
lot of positivity there.
Sorry.
Stay away from me and stay over there.
I think ageism is a fundamental problem, and self-ageism.
But I think people need to make an effort. You can't. You have to, I mean, I think there's this whole thing, like again, like often people come into hospital with an issue, and suddenly it's the hospital's problem, or there needs to be a little bit of self. You've got to work into it. So you have to use your brain, you have to use your muscle. It's not going to happen by itself, and you'll have to make an investment and take it on.
I think we're going to leave there because we're running a little bit behind time. I would just like to Okay, so our next speaker is Joanne Cregan. Joanne is from the Western Health and Social Care Trust, and I'm really delighted to have our partners from our colleagues from across the border here today, because one of the really successful themes of the health service in this area has been the cooperation with our colleagues across the border, right across the board, from HR projects to acute services to initiatives such as coaching and mentoring networks. So I'm really interested to hear what Joanne has to say. She leads out on Drink Wise, Age Well, and in particular the programme that Joanne's going to be discussing is an integrated community-based approach around 4 major pillars, and I'm looking at this through the lens of the HSE and our addiction services: delivering direct interventions, developing individual and community resilience to alcohol misuse, prevention, campaigning and training, and of course workforce skills development, which is an area that I'm particularly interested in myself. What do our workforce, what do our right across the board from acute to community services, how do we need to equip our workforce to deal with these issues? So you're very welcome, Joanne, and
I'm very conscious I'm on the wrong side of the stretch break and possibly lunch. It's both a privilege and quite daunting to be on the same lineup as our previous speakers and the speakers to come. But it has been a bit heartening to know that what we're doing on the ground has, and I can't multitask, I'm agreeing with that.
It's okay, nobody can multitask, it's a complete myth. It's attention switching.
So it's heartening to know that some of the things that we're doing on the ground to try and address the issues that we're raising today are in keeping with what's been said already. I'm sure some of the previous speakers have seen my presentation, just stole some of my slides. But I suppose just to start off, I'm actually an employee of the Addiction, which is part of the Inspire group. And we work very closely. We work within the Western Health and Social Care Trust and cover the same geography, which takes in Derry, sort of Lumabadi, Strabane, Omagh and Fermanagh. So really, this project has been running now for almost 5 years and is part of a UK-wide consortium where a number of key leaders in the addiction field got together to see that this is an emerging issue and what do we do to try and address it. It came about because we have an ageing population, which has already been highlighted. Hazardous and harmful drinking was declining in all age groups, apart from in the over 50s. And also we were seeing that the combined effect of an ageing population plus an increase in consumption was causing great concern. In Northern Ireland, again, that just reflected those statistics, and looking at sort of the over 60 age group was where the biggest increase in consumption was being seen. And I suppose what was really important at the start of our journey in this programme was that alcohol consumption rates weren't really being collected in the over 75 population. Sort of like our household surveys and that just weren't picking up on it, and just decided that we'll stop asking people about their alcohol consumption when they reach a certain age. We'll just let them be. Earlier this year we released a new study which was conducted by our partners from Queen's University, and it really just looked at the healthcare costs of alcohol consumption amongst the over 50s, so looking at sort of primary care, acute care, emergency care, and that was an estimation around £125 million. Again, there was a lack of information there, so a lot of this is based on assumptions based on similar areas throughout the UK, but that alone is really startling, and I think what we have to get our head around is why are we waiting until people fall, and why are we waiting to treat people? It's great that we do, and it's great that we have services that do, but really we should be investing some of that money in the preventative side of things and getting our head around seriously around what are effective preventative measures. Some of this may have been covered already, so what makes older adults more at risk? So basically the physical process of aging and how we process a lot of substances, not just alcohol, changes, so that can have a big effect. It can exacerbate or accelerate other conditions which are associated with aging. The combined use of medications, we find, and I'm sure you all find, that when people are presenting and using other medications, it can have a knock-on effect as well. But we also find that some of our clients that come to us will have stopped using their other medications so that they can continue drinking, and then obviously their other conditions may worsen. Again, problems associated with undetected by professionals. Either people just aren't confident enough to ask the questions and know how to ask it without opening up maybe a can of worms that they don't feel qualified to deal with, or even, I suppose, making assumptions about people, sure it's their last pleasure, or leave them alone, or just not even thinking that it could be an issue for an older adult. It can be more hidden, the shame and stigma surrounding it. People tend to hide their drinking and don't talk about it as much in older adults. And alcohol treatment support tends not to be so responsive to the older adult. Around accessibility and mobility issues, in our programme tried to address some of those issues and highlight some. We find through sometimes there are arbitrary age limits put on services, like after 65 there may not be addiction services there available, so people then tend to go into care homes and things and other settings that aren't really addressing the needs that they have. So our model then, Drink Wise Age Well, it's a community-based integrated programme. Really our strapline is really looking to help people make healthier choices about alcohol as they age, and whether that's reducing or abstaining, it depends really on the individual themselves. We have a 7-year programme delivered in 5 UK sites, so there's ourselves within the Western Coast area, Glasgow, Cumtath and Wales, Sheffield and Devon, so it's a real pilot opportunity for us to see what works. It's fully evaluated and supported by the University of Bedfordshire. And we did a baseline survey before we started off with almost 17,000 people over 50. Our delivery model, and this might be very clear, but I'll talk you through it. In terms of, at the centre circle there is our direct engagement and support. So we would have a team of people who go out and deliver this support within people's homes, as trying to break down some of the barriers of people coming forward for service. They would deliver sort of one-to-one therapeutic and social support within their homes or community settings, wherever is most suitable to the person. And the types of things that they would do with it is looking at sort of public health questionnaire, audit, GAD, and where people are concerned about their MACA. Our team would look around the Montreal Cognitive Assessment to try and signpost people onto relevant services and make the most of those opportunities and conversations. We also run mutual aid partnerships, which are basically peer support groups that are there for people to come forward. They're very solution focused, and the aim is that we sort of train people up as they become part of the group, then to facilitate their own groups. The feedback that we're getting is that these really work for people, not only just in terms of the sort of practical tools that we're giving people, but also the fact that they're age specific. People find that it's a comfort that they're coming together with people who have maybe similar experiences. We also offer family support as well to any concerned others. So then we have our individual and community resilience. And it's nice to know, because sometimes this part gets referred to as the fluffy part of the project. But in hearing this morning's presentations, I suppose it really reinforces why we're doing what we're doing. So through our resilience programs, we run a 6-week group program that looks at a healthy mind, healthy body, and the various things that people can be adapting in their life to give themselves that bit extra support. They build their resilience and build their coping skills and hope that they won't turn to alcohol as a coping mechanism. But then having a way of connecting people back into their community. So the loneliness, the isolation, we're finding that people sometimes just have forgotten to reconnect or don't have a confidence to reconnect to activities going on in their own environment. So we try to give people tasters of things around physical activity or sort of arts or crafts or different things like that to get people back out and active again and try out new things. So they develop new skills, meet new people, and after our programme then we're encouraging them to keep that on in their own spare time. Our training and workforce skills development is really about informing, upskilling and giving people who are dealing with this in the front line that bit more information and knowledge and confidence whenever somebody's presenting that may have alcohol related issues to firstly know how to identify where there is a problem, think about the ways in which it's brought up because it can be a sensitive issue to broach to somebody, but then also knowing how to support people under the relevant services and what services are out there. So we have different levels of training which we offer to a range of different audiences, and we are now we're now offering out training around alcohol-related cognitive impairment as well, just identifying that this is a huge area of work that needs to be done. Our prevention and campaigning aspect really goes out into the community and does many public spaces, shopping centres, rural fairs, anything that we can be at, we're at to try and start those conversations and allow people the opportunity to engage, ask questions, will it be for themselves or other people. One of our initiatives, I suppose, again, people would wonder why we do what we do. Just over a year ago, we ran a Drink Wise and Jive, where we went for a world record around jiving. But the whole build up to that was really, I suppose, getting people involved in activities, getting people involved in dancing, connecting. The word record wasn't really the main aim, and thank God, because we didn't make it. But it was really connecting people and even getting people going, what is that about? What's the connection there? It started a conversation and got people, and we were able to, I suppose we were really trying to address the stigma and the shame and come at it from a sort of non-judgmental, non-dictative approach and involving people in something fun. And our evidence or evaluation after that showed that it was very successful in terms of reducing stigma and shame and people feeling more confident to come forward for support. And the more we talk about it and normalise it, the easier it is for people to do so in their own communities and families. Circulating all that we do then, we're always very conscious, we're very much evidence-based. And we're constantly evaluating what we do with different screening tools and different outcome tools that we have attached to the various aspects. We really try to engage our community in what we do, and we have various advocacy groups involved to inform our practice. We don't have all the answers, and we're constantly learning and sharing that learning. And very much trying to influence public policy as well. And from what we're learning here, we have a great opportunity to try and share that and influence that, whether it be commissioning frameworks or just simply in how our partners and ourselves, how we operate. To give you an idea of just perhaps how somebody, it doesn't always work out this way, but how our project can sort of work. We have Mary, a housing officer who attends some training within work. And she's very aware of the service users she has, and she can identify how Brian might need some of the support. So she goes back with information and works with Brian on this and gets referred into our direct engagement and support, who then joins our mutual aid partnerships and then begins to become a facilitator and supports other peers as well. We've Brian's daughter then, who's also affected obviously by Brian's drinking. So looks for some support for herself, and we offer the 5-step family model. And then starts to take this back into her homework, and looks to get involved in our prevention campaigning side of things, which then has a knock-on effect on others becoming volunteers. And you can see just how if there's a joint service, and it doesn't have to be under one roof, but if we join up our services together, people can naturally have a knock-on effect and a more positive outcome, hopefully, for those involved. So it's of no surprise, I'm sure, to people in the room, just of the most cited reasons that we are hearing from people who have engaged with our service of why people may be turning to alcohol. So retirement, that loss of sense of purpose. Finances, whether people have less money and that's a stress, or they have more money and time in their hands, can influence it. Bereavement and the lack of social opportunities, which is why we do what we do. Surprising to us, it was 4 in 5 adults that were at risk had never been asked about their drinking by family, friends, or other health visitors, and part of that could have been the confidence to do so. And stigma and shame were huge in terms of people not coming forward for service, which is a big shame, because we know that when older adults do come forward for service, they tend to have very successful outcomes. To show a bit of the impact that we've been having, these statistics are between June 2015 and September 2018. We're just about to get another impact report, so apologies, they're slightly out of date. But to give you an idea of just the impact that we are having, 110 people had attended our peer support groups, and some do so for varying amounts of time depending on their need, which is a nice way that we're not going, you can have 6 sessions and out the door, because that's not a real way to support recovery or that ongoing recovery. 40 family members, and I think that this is where it's really hard to engage family members in support, because they often don't see their own family or their own needs. They just want to help and support the person with the alcohol issue. The common triggers, again, were bereavement and that loss of sense of purpose and relationship issues. The 200 one-to-one assessments, I suppose there's a fairly balanced breakdown in terms of gender coming forward for service, but 73% were under 65. People were drinking alone, but when we look at the average age that people said they first started experiencing problems was around the age of 39, so I suppose that's learning for us in terms of how we tailor our services going forward. The average number of drinking days people were, when they entered our service, the average number was around 14 in a 28-day period, so every other day, and drinking around 21 units, and I know this is another, again, where the standards are quite different across the geographies. But I suppose then on exiting, people were having the number of days that they were drinking, and the amount that they drank was a third then. And a follow-up, which is really important that we do a follow-up with our clients as well, that had maintained or reduced as well. And I think the 6-month follow-up, we don't always have the luxury of being able to do that with time restraints and demands in our work. But what we found in doing that was, one, we were getting to check in with people to see how they were doing and how effective our service was. But if people weren't doing well, it was a way of getting them back in and getting them more support. But if they weren't doing well, it was a real time for them to sit and reflect about how far they come in a year or 2 years or whatever, and think back to when they first started with us. So we found that had real tremendous benefit there. Our social activities, I suppose they really showed people having an increase in their emotional well-being, an increase in their sense of purpose and being involved in something, and their drinking was decreased. Even though this aspect of the programme, it touches on alcohol, it brings it up, but it's not very much in your face, but people are still reporting that they reduced their alcohol intake as a result. Attendees were saying that they can feel better in themselves, and 99% said they intended to make positive changes as a result of attending the group sessions. So in the community, we would be through our prevention and campaigning and that, we are in touch with thousands of people throughout the Western Trust area, and we use the opportunities as much as possible to conduct alcohol brief interventions. And 46% of people were saying that was the first time they'd been asked about their alcohol use, and 48% said that they would make changes as a result. our training skills development again. It's just looking at how people plan to change their practice and improve, be more mindful of the age-specific issues around alcohol. At the side there, I know some people have already picked them up. Every year as well, in terms of our policy and practice, we would produce reports around alcohol in the workforce. How do we prepare people for retirement? How do we support people? But our latest one was around calling time, so it was addressing ageism and age discrimination, alcohol and policy. And within this, it just highlights things that we can do, whether we're a commissioner of service, whether we're researchers, whether we're delivering services. It's just how we can sort of be mindful of it and maybe alter our practice just slightly to reach out and support more people. From that came our advocacy group, which brought about this advocacy for change, or charter for change, which is really trying to influence policy and practice going forward and looking about the key things that they're looking for. So they're looking some services that are free from judgment, services that build up their resilience and their coping skills, and services that are really tailored towards their age group and mindful of their needs as they age. We have loads and loads of material and animation and different campaigns that we've run throughout our Facebook page and website of jointwiseagewell.org or .org.uk. You can speak to me afterwards if you want any of our material or that. That's me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanne. That was really useful to see a model operating, because the earlier speakers were talking about the scale of the problem, the causes of the problem, and some of the optimistic messages about it. But this is an applied model where you see in practice the response, the organisations working together to respond to the issues. I particularly like the whole focus on MEC, as we call it in the HSE, making every contact count, which is all about frontline practitioners right across the board, from primary care through to old people services, ID services, etc. And actually taking the opportunity in a clinical setting to have those difficult conversations, to ask the question about alcohol use or misuse, and you know, in a podiatry clinic or in a dental clinic or in a GP visit or whatever, to actually, you know, kind of get us having those conversations with the patients, service users, clients of the services. Okay, so we're slightly behind time, and I was hoping to have somebody here to do a kind of a formal stretch break with us, but that hasn't happened. So if everybody wants to just get up and have a little wriggle, and then a little stretch, touch your toes if you want to do that. Roll your shoulders. Okay, we're not having a formal break, so we're going to sit down again now. We'll move on. Okay, so our next speaker is from the Donegal ETB, Christina Murray McElhenney, and Christina works with the Alcohol Forum and the Northwest Regional Drug and Alcohol Task Force on various projects. She's a member of the National Addiction Training Programme, the Alcohol Forum Training and Education Subgroup, and the Prevention and Education Subgroup of the NWRDATF. I don't know what that is, the NWRDATF. So hopefully Christina will keep us informed about that. Oh, is it the Alcohol and Drugs Task Force? Yes, sorry, I do know what that was. Okay, so she was also involved in the pilot initiative, A Prescription for Healthy Pregnancy in Letterkenny Hospital in 2014. So please be welcome to Christina.
Okay, everybody, I just had a wee bit of a mass exodus there, and I'm kind of panicking and say, no, you are prisoners now for the next 10 minutes. It's tough sitting through all of this talking, and there's an incredible amount of processing going on and trying to take information in and process it and think on your practice and all of these issues that are coming up with, I suppose, positive aging and alcohol. And very interestingly, I turned 50 in the summer, and I know you're thinking, no way. But yeah, so when I was asked to do this, it was like, oh, right, I've never really looked at this area before. And interestingly, I thought to myself, okay, so first of all, I need to look at, okay, how do we define, I suppose, aging and older age group? So I went online and decided, okay, so what is the definition of getting older age groups, that type of thing? And I was kind of taken back because some of it was saying 60s and over, 65 and over, some of it was saying into the 70s, etc. And then I came across stuff that was saying from your 50s up, and I was going, no, I'm not having it. You know, so it's interesting how, like earlier speakers had said, you know, I suppose the years aren't really the way to define it, you know, and it is how you're feeling, how your health is, how your thinking is, how your emotional health, all of those things, how your general well-being is. And all of the things that were mentioned earlier, we could all relate to them. We could all relate to the stress, we could all relate to the lack of sleep, we could all relate to those type of things and what we're not doing well for our well-being. So I've been involved in the screening programme, screening and brief interventions for the National Addiction Programme for a number of years now. And interestingly, I got on to them yesterday and I said, can you tell me how many people are trained around the country now in screening and brief interventions? And we're about to launch SARE 2, which is the next model from the original model of screening and brief interventions. And I'm told there's 5,000 people around the country now trained in screening and brief interventions. So then I began to think to myself, okay, I have been rolling out this training for a number of years around Donegal, Sligo and Leitrim. And interestingly, at no point in time were there many conversations about alcohol and positive aging and about screening for the older age group. So this really fascinated me to start to, I really didn't have enough time to read into it, but I'm absolutely totally interested in it now. And you were saying earlier that some of the information might be quite depressing, so I thought I'd put a nice good photograph on there. This is me in 20 years. This is not me now, so I don't know how I'm going to get there. But then I heard the story about the retirement and people getting in, you know, into exercise and really concentrating on themselves. So let's be hopeful. Okay, let's be hopeful about our health and well-being. And let's be hopeful about the conversations that we can actually have around alcohol and how it impacts on our health and well-being. But we also must realise, you know, I suppose the negative impact of this and where we are. So alcohol consumption 30% higher than other European countries. 23% of over 65s abstain from alcohol, which is slightly higher than the younger age groups where we're saying maybe 19-20% abstain from alcohol. So there's a little bit of an increase in abstention, and like the earlier speakers, it might be down to the combination of medication, etc., or just naturally, I suppose, cutting down and giving it up. 10% of the over 65s consume alcohol on more than 4 days in a week. So that's pretty regular consumption. And we have two, I suppose, main categories of consumers of alcohol when we get into that older age group. We have the early onset use, which means that they may have been using a lot of alcohol for a lot of their life. Okay? And we also have the scenario where you have the late onset user. So maybe they weren't a moderate heavy user of alcohol, but because of all of the things mentioned earlier, retirement, bereavement, you know, things that happen in your life, changes in your life, they may have become more interested in using alcohol maybe for self-medication, boredom, all of the reasons that were given earlier without going over and over them. So those are the two main categories that are using alcohol. But it is an increasing public health concern because all of our information is telling us that we are going to have an older population and that's going to keep increasing. So indeed it's a concern, but are you hearing much about positive aging and alcohol use in older generations? Are you actually hearing it? Have you heard any public health advertisements around it? Conversations around it? It's really subliminal, isn't it? It's really not out there, it's not overt. And part of the concern as well is the combination of, I suppose, using the CNS depressant and other over-the-counter medications. As well as that, you know, illegal drugs, yeah, older people, there are still older people involved in the use of illegal drugs and the combination of using alcohol, and then other possible medications, what impact does that have on, and then prescription medication and the combination of using alcohol as well. Now I know this isn't a very nice slide, but it's something else that it came to mind. We hear an awful lot about, you know, slips and falls and injuries and, you know, perhaps and everything, and I have never, ever, ever heard any person say, my mother had alcohol in her whenever she slipped and cracked her hip or broke her arm or wrist. That has never been part of the conversation, so it's very interesting, isn't it? So we really don't know how much alcohol is involved in these injuries in the home with our elderly population. So, being involved in the rollout of the SARE, the Screening and Brief Intervention Programme, it is an evidence-based psychosocial intervention for alcohol and other drugs. It's underpinned by a person-centred approach, and it's infused with the skills of motivational interviewing. And motivational interviewing is an absolutely beautiful way to approach any difficult subject in a way that you can have a very gentle conversation, and at all times you're taking cues from the individual as to whether they want to continue this conversation, or they're not ready for it, or it's too difficult for them, or they're embarrassed, ashamed, all of those things that were brought up earlier on. You know, so motivational interview teaches us to take the cues and to understand that at the end of the day, whatever individual we're actually working with in practice, they're autonomous, and this is their choice whether they wish to engage or not. Okay? So it's rolled out around the country. This is how the models actually worked, evidence-based. We do know the brief interventions work. They may not work right away, so they may not work for the first 2 or 3 months, but 6 months down the line. They may kick in a year down the line, they may kick in, but what we do know about it is we can't unhear the information that you have given yourself around your drinking. So something we have it in our heads, we know what we're doing every day, but when we actually speak of it and we share that very personal information with someone else, it kind of comes back and gently confronts us as well. That we realise we said it to someone else and now it's out there. And maybe I'm not really ready to do anything about it yet, but I'm now more conscious of it than what I was before. So this model talks about being supportive, asking and assessing. And we're going to look at the tools that are used for asking and assessing. And it's interesting because I have discovered something new. Offer assistance and then refer. So it's a nice simple model, and there's lovely steps to go through whenever you're trained in this. So, support, connecting with the person, having that open and friendly style, having an empathetic and non-judgmental approach, supporting their self-efficacy and informing the person of the services that are available. So that's really kind of part of the whole support area of this model of intervention. And the interesting thing about this model of intervention is originally it was developed for the services in A&E, and SARE 2 now is basically developed for community practitioners, youth workers, you know, whoever it is that's out there coming into contact with other individuals as part of their work or their volunteering that may be, I suppose, beginning to have issues around alcohol and other drugs. So we can all do it. It's all possible for us to have these conversations, and I suppose in the end signpost and refer on to services that will support the individual. So the ask and assess is about asking about alcohol and substance use, eliciting the person's own concerns, so hearing what they have to say about their use, okay, and listening very attentively to them. Establishing their own expectations. And interestingly, you know, there are places where a screening tool is appropriate as part of your work, but once you learn the methodology of the screening tool, you don't have to take out that piece of paper. You can have a general conversation around it when you have the information embedded and recorded in that brain that can expand to take in that information, although I do doubt myself sometimes when I'm trying to learn stuff. Screening and assessment. So we know a couple of screening tools quite commonly, but we need to look at those screening tools. Observing for withdrawal symptoms, exploring the context in which they are consuming the alcohol. And our earlier speakers alluded to the context and the social world and how it may have changed going into retirement, through bereavement, through family circumstances, all those things. Engaging, I suppose, the person's importance of whether they wish to make the change or not, or their confidence around whether they can make the change or not. So the motivational interviewing tools are used on that, the scales from 1 to 10. And then the other part of that is the O part, where advising and giving feedback. So it's actually, you know, you've told me about your drinking now, so have a wee look at your score. So your score is now bringing you into this category where it could be in the category of high risk, or it could be in the category of dependency. They may never have assumed that or weighed that up for themselves in that way. So it might take a wee bit of time for them to take that information on board, because it could be quite a shock to some people as to where their drinking actually is. And if I was to tell you that if you do consume a bottle of wine at the weekend, imagine telling me this on Friday, but if you do consume a bottle of wine, you could be having up to 7 or 8 standard drinks, which is the equivalent of having 7 or 8 Kinder Morgans, 7 or 8 vodkas, 7 or 8 gins. Okay? So it can be kind of shocking. I didn't think I was actually drinking that much. You know. So, and then the refer bit then is discussing the treatment options with the person, making a referral to the appropriate services if required, and ensuring the appropriate follow-up care and support, and closing the consultation. So broadening that remit, okay, I have to say that in some ways, you know, my mind is thinking, oh my God, we have ignored whole population here. We have basically not paid any attention to it at all. And yet we talk about role modelling, and we talk about our younger people, and it's always to the forefront, our younger people, our younger people, our younger people. But where are all the influences on the younger people? Well, it's us, and it's us aging and what we do as well. We're the influencers. So we would hope that in the SARE 2, as it's rolled out, that all of these different agencies become involved. So what that does then is that creates conversation among many disciplines. And with that conversation among many disciplines, then you get a cultural conversation going. And then we're talking more about alcohol and our consumption of it, and we're becoming more aware of it. And the more aware of it that you become, then the more conflict you have around your own use of it as well, interestingly enough. So mental health services, acute care services, child and family services, community-based drug services, homeless agencies, primary care services, third level colleges, criminal justice, youth and sporting. And I would say, and any others that are interested in having these real conversations around alcohol use, because it equips you in such a way that you gain a bit of confidence around having that gentle conversation. So how do we have that conversation? Okay. Well, to screen, you need to use the screening tool to find out where the person is actually at and what their consumption is like. So I had a look at the screening tool and had a look at a wee bit of research around the screening tool, and what it told me, and I was quite shocked to myself, having been involved in this area in education and training, I suppose, to think how we have ignored the older generation, and have we looked at the tools enough, and have we looked at that area of research enough, and are our tools for screening fit for purpose for an age group and the issues that age group might actually be experiencing. So some of you may have heard of the audit, which is 10 questions to ascertain where the person's drinking is at, and how it's impacting on the individual's life. So I went searching and I thought, well, now I've just discovered a journal or two which is questioning the validity of asking those questions to an older population, and are those questions actually relevant? And I discovered this other one called the SMAST, which is the Short Michigan Alcohol Screening Test Geriatric Version. And it's there since 91. What year is this anyway? So how many decades is that in existence? And how much do we know about it? I feel very bad up here not knowing much about it, and I have a lot of reading to do, so I do. But these are the 10 questions that are asked as part of the screening tool, and I'll run through them. How often do you have a drink containing alcohol? So they're going to tell you how many times a week. How often, how many drinks containing alcohol do you have in a typical day when you're drinking? And I want you to think about these questions and think about their appropriateness for the cohort that you may be asking these questions of. How often do you have 6 or more drinks on one occasion? How often during the last year have you found you're not able to stop drinking once you had started? How often during the last year have you failed to do what was normally expected of you for your drinking?
How often during the last year have you needed a first drink in the morning to get yourself going after a heavy day? How often during the last year have you had a feeling of guilt or remorse after drinking? And how often during the last year have you been unable to remember what happened the night before because you have been drinking? Have you or someone else been injured as a result of your drinking? And has a relative, friend or doctor or other health worker been concerned about your drinking or suggested you cut down? Now, what do you think about the context and the appropriateness and the application of those questions? Is there any things coming up for you?
Well, I think you need to set it. They don't automatically feel comfortable that you could straight out ask somebody to help. So I think you need to be building a rapport, and you need to be at least letting the person know more about entering this bit. So
Absolutely. Absolutely. So that's the whole relationship and the environment and the permission. The asking the permission. Is it okay if we have a look at your drinking? When we score those questions, we get an indication of where the drinking is at. Okay, so it is self-reported. Okay, it's not completely 100% correct, and people will report what they want you to know and how comfortable they are with the information that they're sharing with you. Okay, but it gives us a general idea, and it talks about under 7 lower risk, 8 to 15 increasing, 16 to 19, and 20 plus dependency. However, this other tool that I found interesting. Okay, and what I thought is, okay, right, I see where this approach is actually coming from, because the questions that are asked here, okay, it's a yes or a no. So they don't even have to think 2 or 3 times, 5 times, whatever it is. It's a yes or a no. When talking with others, do you ever underestimate how much you drink? Yes or no? After a few drinks, have you sometimes not eaten or being able to skip a meal because you didn't feel hungry? Does having a few drinks help decrease your shakiness or your tremors? Does alcohol sometimes make it hard for you to remember parts of the day or night? Do you usually take a drink to relax or calm your nerves? Do you drink to take your mind off your problems? Have you ever increased your drinking after experiencing a loss in your life? Has a doctor or nurse said that they were worried or concerned about your drinking? Have you ever made rules to manage your drinking? And when you feel lonely, does having a drink help? Now, what do you think of those questions? I was delighted to find this. Now I have to go back to National Addiction Training Programme and go, hey guys, we have left this out. We have not considered this cohort in this national programme and our approach.
I was just going to say, not even just for the cohort, to me that is actually getting at the reasons why, underlying why people drink. So I actually think it's relevant to all ages. I'm not an alcohol expert, but we need to be getting to the core of why people drink.
So during the screening process, people will give you answers. The earlier, the audit, and those answers and scores that you give are conversation openers. So you can get to why they are actually drinking in their social context or what their reasons are. This is directly asking them to think about this without scoring first, and then it's a gentler process, and the questions are very relative to their current experiences. So yeah, I found that fascinating. So but it is a gentle confrontation for anybody to give that personal information. And given that personal information, they're giving you an insight into their private life. And whilst you're a practitioner and you're doing this all of the time, and you're completely comfortable with the environment, and you're completely comfortable with the work that you do, to always remember that the person you're coming into contact, this might be one of the most difficult days they're going to have in the week. With this gentle confrontation in your presence, talking about something that is very personal, and all of the personal reasons why they have taken to maybe getting involved in using too much alcohol in their life, for whatever their reasons might be. So it is underpinned by that person-centered approach, and it is about unconditional positive regard, that non-judgmental approach. It is about empathy and understanding. Like, if I was in their shoes, what would I be doing? If my life, was in the same circumstances, what would my choices be? Because it is about their choices. And that genuineness in any type of helping relationship just has to be there, or that helping relationship is not actually going to work. So what I'm taking from this opportunity, I'm delighted to have been asked, what I'm taking from the opportunity is to think I really need to open my thinking, and I really need to delve into this area that we have largely ignored as a society for such a long time. We don't have programs like the program that was just spoken about there. I don't know of any in the Republic of Ireland, and I stand here to be corrected if there are, but we have a body of work to do. Why do these things always turn into a heap of work after this? So listen, what I want to say is to get thinking around that age group and get thinking in the context of their lives and how we frame questions going forward whenever we're screening for use of alcohol, and then all of the implications of the use of alcohol and their other medications in the context of their life as well. So what I want to say is, after all of that information, thank you and have a lovely weekend.
Thank you so much, Christina. And it's really useful to see some practical tools as well, and to hear about the experience here in Donegal. Our last, but by no means least, speaker of the day is Dr. Helen McMonagle. And Helen is the rehabilitation coordinator for people affected by alcohol-related brain injury in Donegal. Her particular area of interest is around the impact of alcohol on brain health across the lifespan. And I, for one, am really interested in hearing about what Helen's research has to say on the matter. So it'll be over to Helen, and then I'll just make a few concluding remarks, just pulling together some of the strands from today's discussions, and then we'll close. Okay?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so very much for coming in for today's session. It's great to see such a good turnout, and it's always lovely as well to have an event like this in Donegal, because I think we're all travelling to Dublin a lot of the time for CPD points. So, and what an interesting morning it has been as well. I think what's been rolling around in my head is, whenever I have thought about the idea of successful aging in the past, I have always quantified that as the number of years that we live, or how long we live to be, you know. But I think listening to some of the speakers here this morning and being familiar with some of their work as well, it's really affirmed to me that it is the life in those years that really matters, and I think it's been really empowering to see just how much control we can have over the aging process and our quality of life as we age as well. I suppose from the Alcohol Forum's perspective, it's been wonderful to see alcohol being recognised as a modifiable risk factor in positive aging as well. And I think it has been really important to examine, you know, how much we are drinking as we age, why we might be taking a few extra drinks as we get older, but equally why we need to act. And also as well that if we do act, we can be successful in addressing this issue, as Joanne has pointed out. I guess in terms of my own input today, I'm very aware of the approximation that over 2/3 of people over the age of 65 who have problematic alcohol use will have developed that pattern of use prior to the onset of the age, or prior to the age of 50. And what that means is that by the time they reach services for older people, sometimes there's already a very extended and established pattern of harmful alcohol use. And what that means really is that, you know, that can really, I suppose, change the way and the focus in which we work with people. The pattern of use is very different. And I think as well that a proportion of people having had that extended history of alcohol use may be affected by this condition here that I'm about to talk about, alcohol-related brain injury. Now, alcohol-related brain injury, it is a very significant and a very complex disability that primarily develops in the 4th, 5th or 6th decade of life, sometimes earlier. And the reason that that's important is that because if a person is affected by this condition, they may be affected by it for a large portion of their adult life, which means that they will have difficulty availing of some of the positive factors, or some of the factors associated with positive aging that we have looked at here today. You know, things like social participation and active citizenship and new learning and good mental health and good physical health as well. So it can be a devastating condition for the individual, it can be a devastating condition for the families as well. But the main message I really want to give here today is that alcohol-related brain injury, it is a preventable condition, and we can all inform ourselves about how to reduce our risk of developing this condition, but also as well, if we're working with people with harmful alcohol use, that we're aware of some of the signs and indicators of this condition so that we can capture it earlier, where opportunities for recovery are likely to be at their greatest. I think people find it helpful if I just start by giving a kind of an overview of what an alcohol-related brain injury is and what an alcohol-related brain injury is not. It's slightly different to other neurological conditions associated with age, so it's different to the likes of stroke, it's different to the likes of traumatic brain injuries, such as a brain injury we develop as a direct result of a trauma to the head, such as a fall. And it's also as well different from a progressive dementia type picture, such as Alzheimer's. When I talk about an alcohol-related brain injury, I am talking about a range of conditions that develop as a consequence of the damage caused to the brain through excessive alcohol misuse. Now, we're all really familiar that alcohol can cause a lot of damage to our internal organs, our liver and our heart, but maybe what we're not quite as familiar with is the fact that alcohol can actually cause damage to the physical structure of our brain and cause changes to the way that our brain operates as well. The brain, it's a very, very delicate organ. It's very vulnerable to the negative effects of alcohol, and it actually remains one of the major target organs of alcohol as an alcohol use disorder progresses in much the same way as the liver. And that is when a person starts to notice maybe changes in their memory, their thinking skills, and other important brain-based skills that allow myself or yourself to navigate our way through life in a very, very safe and independent way. Now, the changes associated with alcohol-related brain injury, they can come on quite slowly, quite gradually, quite insidiously, really sneaking up on a person over a long period of time, around a decade, or it can come on quite suddenly. In order to understand both of those processes, I just want to go through some of the ways in which alcohol does the harm the brain. So the first is through toxicity. The bad news, alcohol, it is a toxin, and that is why we say someone is intoxicated if they have been drinking to excess. It is also why we use alcohol to sterilise objects such as needles and surgical equipment, because it's capable of killing microorganisms really quickly. And one of the reasons that it's actually able to do that is because alcohol has a really, really simple molecular structure, not too dissimilar from water, and that means that it can penetrate almost all cells, all tissues and all organs in our body. Now, compounding the toxicity of alcohol is the fact that in order for alcohol to be cleared from the body, it needs to be converted into another substance first. It needs to be converted into acetaldehyde. And acetaldehyde is a particularly toxic byproduct of alcohol that can cause toxic damage to brain cells and the building blocks of the brain as well. Alcohol can also cause harm to the brain through chronic dehydration. Alcohol actually affects a part of the brain known as the pituitary gland, which you can see highlighted in this image here. And the pituitary gland, it has many different roles and functions within the body. But one of its primary roles is to ensure that any fluid we take into our body is held on long enough for it to sustain processes in our body. So anytime we take a drink of water, it prevents that drink of water directly flowing through our body almost immediately. It allows us to hold on to it for as long as it's needed before it's then filtered and then expelled as urine. So alcohol, it is a diuretic of kinds. It increases the output of urine. And just to give you an example of that, if you were to drink a relatively, I suppose, four shots of alcohol, that can result your body to expel in excess of 1 litre of fluid from your body in the form of urine, okay? So if you were to take that to a full bottle of vodka, for example, that can cause you to flush out in excess of 2.5 litres of fluid from your body in the form of urine. And that can be bad news to the brain, because the brain, it's a really, really thirsty organ. It's made up of about 80% water itself.
Now what happens is, if you become dehydrated as a result of your drinking through the process that we just talked about, because the brain has so much water in storage, other organs in the body will begin to draw water down from the brain to sustain their own processes, and that's when you see the effects of a hangover, a dehydration, a headache. A short-term dehydration, it's not going to cause really any harm to the brain so long as your hydration levels are restored again, but long-term chronic dehydration associated with long-term heavy alcohol use can actually cause shrinkage and withering in the brain, equivalent to about 2.5 months of progressive Alzheimer's disease. And just to give you a sense of what that would look like at the level of the brain, we have 2 images here on your left-hand side from a 52-year-old healthy male, no, a 59-year-old healthy male, excuse me, and then 2 images on your right-hand side are from a man with alcohol-related brain injury. So if you look at the surface area of the brain in the top 2 images, you can see that in the person with alcohol-related brain injury, you can see that the surface area of the brain has started to shrink away, and that is due to the effects of chronic dehydration and toxicity. It can also be picked up in the kind of the midsections of the brain. If we look at the bottom 2 images, the area that we're looking at here is the area highlighted in green, which is one of the ventricles of the brain. And the reason that it's bigger in the person with alcohol-related brain injury is because the area that surrounds the ventricle has started to waste away or started to shrink, causing the ventricle to expand into this area. So the structural changes associated with the condition, they can be quite profound as well. Another primary mechanism through which alcohol can harm the brain is actually through thiamine deficiency. And thiamine deficiency, it's very, very common in people with alcohol use disorders. Malnourishment is very common because people who are drinking a lot of alcohol, they may be neglecting their nutrition, and they do that for a variety of reasons, due to poverty or limited finances associated with substantial addiction, the discomfort of eating as well, because alcohol can disrupt the lining of your stomach, making it uncomfortable for you to eat. Also as well, if you have gastrointestinal difficulties, they might be experiencing regular diarrhea or vomiting, or sometimes in some cases they may be homeless and just not have the resources to prepare food for themselves. So it's not surprising therefore that about 80% of people who have an alcohol use disorder will be simultaneously malnourished in key vitamins for brain health. And one of the most important vitamins for brain health, particularly when we're looking at the alcohol-related brain injuries, it's vitamin B1, it's thiamine. And the reason that vitamin B1 is so critically important for overall brain health is because it helps convert carbohydrate into energy for our brain. So if we become deficient in vitamin B1, that can leave our brains starved of essential energy. Now what we do know is that very little thiamine or vitamin B1 is actually stored within the body. So we need an almost continual supply from external sources, our food primarily, okay? And we can become depleted very quickly in it as well, within about maybe 2 weeks of reduced intake. The only organ in the body that's actually capable of storing vitamin B1 or thiamine in any significant quantity is the liver. And we know that that can be damaged through excessive alcohol misuse. So if you're drinking to the level where your liver is being impaired by your alcohol use, you will experience an automatic reduction in the amount of thiamine or vitamin B1 that can be made available for the brain. And that becomes really important during the process of withdrawal, and this is sometimes called the thiamine irony or the vitamin B1 irony, in that long-term heavy alcohol use will reduce the amount of thiamine in your body, but the process of withdrawal actually places increased requirements on your body and brain for thiamine, okay? And let me just explain that a little bit more. Whenever you take alcohol into your body and your brain recognise that it is a foreign substance, so they go through a whole host of changes to try and adapt to it, okay? So if we look at the brain in particular, the brain will increase certain neurotransmitters and decrease other neurotransmitters in order to cope with the enormous stress that alcohol can actually place it under, okay? Now let's just say a person becomes a regular heavy drinker. Those changes in the brain actually become the natural state of the brain because they need to be maintained so long as alcohol is being consumed. Now let's just say that person then makes the decision that they want to stop drinking and they do that very suddenly. The brain needs to reverse all of these changes and it needs to do it very quickly. And in order to do that, it requires an inordinate amount of energy. And what's the vitamin that supplies the brain with energy? Vitamin B1. So if a person is going through the process of withdrawal from alcohol and they have become deficient in vitamin B1 either as a result of dietary neglect or because of a gastrointestinal difficulty and they're not getting adequate supplementation from an external source, then that can precipitate the onset of a neurological crisis known as fornicase encephalopathy. And Grainne had touched on this earlier on. It's a neurological crisis caused by a severe deficiency in vitamin B1 and it's diagnosed in people with any two of the following. So dietary deficiencies, abnormal eye movements, jerky movements of the eyes, the cerebellar dysfunction, the walking with the broad-based gait. It is considered a medical emergency and requires the administration of a high-potency solution known as Pabernex that's full of lots of different vitamins, but particularly thiamine, and that can be delivered intravenously or intermuscularly. 20% of people who develop fornicase encephalopathy will die from their condition, and over 85% of people who survive the condition may go on to have lasting cognitive impairment or longer lasting brain injury as well. But alcohol-related brain injury doesn't just always come on suddenly. It can come on slowly, gradually, insidiously over a long period of time, really sneaking up on the person unbeknownst to themselves or other people around them. It's almost like a systematic gradual decline over about a decade or so. The earliest signs of it are the dissociative syndrome, so there might be just subtle changes in their day-to-day organisational skills, maybe a deterioration in their problem-solving or goal-setting skills. They may start to have difficulties thinking on their feet or dealing with kind of situations that are a little bit more complex and that are outside of their routine as well. But as we go to the more severe end of the dissociative syndrome, what you might see there is the developing severe difficulties with initiation, so getting started on things that are really important. So they may fail to neglect even the most basic of self-care, and then as time passes they can really go into a downward cycle in terms of their physical health, their mental health, their cognitive health as well. Alcohol-related brain injury is probably most commonly known for memory impairments, but actually changes in memory can be sort of a later feature of this condition. In the beginning it might be subtle changes in their day-to-day memory, and then as you progress towards the more severe end of the spectrum, they can have an almost profound inability to acquire, retain or recall almost any new information. And what that means is that as time passes, there could be an increasingly large period of time for which they have little or no memory of. So it can be a really, really devastating condition. But one of the things that always continues to surprise me is that very few people in the general public have heard of an alcohol-related brain injury. And the diagnosis, even if a person has been struggling with alcohol for a very long period of time, the diagnosis nearly always comes as a surprise or a shock to the family as well. We know that there's been a lot of international campaigns around the harms associated with alcohol, but there's actually been very few that are specific to alcohol-related brain injury. We know that there's a lot of prevention efforts nationally around the prevention of other types of brain injuries. When you think about our national strategies to prevent falls and fractures, you know, how we're encouraged to wear seat belts and helmets when we're riding, this whole big effort at the moment to check for concussion when we're playing sports. But there's nothing really at the moment that supports us in being able to prevent a brain injury associated with this condition and alcohol as well. And we really wanted to fill that gap. So quite recently we were very lucky to get some funding to develop an animation to bring the story of alcohol-related brain injury to life and to increase public awareness of the condition as well. So I really wanted to thank Healthy Ireland and Donegal County Council for providing that funding for us. I also wanted to thank the design department, John Wachowski at Letterkenny IT, who supported us in putting this animation together. But in particular, I wanted to say a big thank you to a very, very talented young design student who's here with us today, Fausto Contes, who has managed to capture the lived experience of an alcohol-related brain injury in a way that we never thought we'd be able to do. So thank you very much, and I'll show you the animation now.
Imagine you had access to the greatest library in the world. A library that held all your greatest memories, accomplishments, and the words of advice and encouragement that have changed your life. Imagine a place that held the maps of the places you loved and cherished and needed to be, the where, the when, and the hows. Imagine a library that held a record of your life and that at each key moment added a book for you to savour later, to help you through good times and bad, to help you navigate through new events and relationships and the ever-moving tide of life. Maybe you didn't realise that you do have access to this place every single day. The brain, your brain, is the most wondrous library that you will ever have or know. It works endlessly to keep records as you pass through life, updating and filling its shelves as new friends and new family come and go, as new skills are learned and mastered, as problems are faced and overcome, helping you navigate each moment, day, month, and year that you live on this earth. But what would happen if this stopped? Stopped slowly or suddenly in the middle of your life. From this point forward, the shelves are no longer updated, left empty, or only snippets of your memories are stored. Who would you be without an ability to remember new people and events and information? Who would you be if you couldn't learn new skills, learn from mistakes, or remember moments of joy as they happened? For more and more people, young men and women, like you and me, this is a reality. Alcohol can cause damage to important parts of your brain that allow you to learn, remember, and problem solve. Drinking too much alcohol for long periods of time can lead to the development of an alcohol-related brain injury, lasting changes that stop you from updating and using the library of your life. It leaves men and women with gaps in memory that may never be filled, and problem-solving difficulties which prevent them making changes in their lives. It is estimated that 1 in 8 people who have difficulties with alcohol will develop this condition, leaving them needing specialist support, which in many cases may not be available. The Alcohol Forum is working to help people understand the damaging impact that alcohol can have on the brain and encourage the development of services to help people affected by this condition. With the right advice and support, we know this condition can be prevented and overcome. We can all make choices that reduce our risk of developing alcohol-related brain injury. Alcohol may be part of your life, but it doesn't need to rob you of your memories. Let's cherish the library of our life by drinking less. For more information, visit alcoholforum.org.
There's no doubting that he has a very, very bright future ahead of him. I suppose I'm really conscious of the time. I know the sun is shining outside, I know it's Friday afternoon, and I know you're probably all dying to get lunch at this stage as well, so I'm going to keep things short and sweet today. So I just wanted to thank every single last one of you for coming here today. I especially wanted to thank all of our speakers. I believe we have some presents here for them as well. They have all juggled so many different commitments to be in the room with us today, so I just want to express my gratitude. Also to Siobhan, who's kind of stepped in at the last moment for us, and she's done an incredible job today, so thank you.
one takeaway from each of the speakers, and yeah, I'm giving my slides for this. Paul started off this morning and he was talking about just the impact of alcohol misuse on the health service and on EDs and on the capacity of the system to be able to respond to the alcohol misuse. And one of the things that I found was really, really useful from his presentation was the description of the different groups, the older single men living alone, the empty nest women, and other cohorts who may need targeted interventions to support their well-being. Sabina, wow, that was amazing. 55,500 people in Ireland living with dementia. And the really inspiring thing from Sabina's message was that there are so many modifiable risk factors, which all of us today can start practicing. Everything from cardiovascular, exercise, getting out in nature, mental stimulation, social engagement, and of course, managing our own alcohol. The message that decline is not a normal part of ageing, personally I found that really, really inspiring. We said this morning that we'd start off by shining a light on whether or not drinking alcohol benefits our health or not, and Sabina was able to present evidence that in fact it doesn't benefit our health. Dr. Grainne,
Imagine you had access to the greatest library in the world. A library that held all your greatest memories, accomplishments, and the words of advice and encouragement that have
But stress is fine. Little access. So we're okay.
I'm like a swan paddling away under the water. Yeah. So Grainne pointed out that 94% of older people are not frail, and that's a really important message for us to get out there. Of course, the 6% who are will require a lot of resource. The description that she gave of the signs of the onset of dementia, where it's really useful to have a template like that. And frailty as a measure of need, I think, is a very important piece. But one of the other takeaways from that discussion was about the comorbidity, the relationship to alcohol and addiction services. The fact that you may not be dealing with somebody who exclusively has an alcohol issue. It may be, there may be cardiovascular or other issues there. Joanne was able to talk to us about a really fabulous model operating across the border and about supporting the solutions to the problems in very tangible ways. Drink Rise, Age Well. I particularly liked, I'm a big fan of us getting our evaluation data and our ducks in a row there. So the evaluation data of a 7-year programme is hugely valuable to all of us, especially in this region, because what's happening across the border is going to be very similar to what's happening here. I thought the data that 6 months after exiting the programme there were still benefits in place was really, really superb, and it's fantastic to see programmes like that are working so well. Christina from the ETB, happy birthday. And 10% of over 65s consume alcohol more than 4 days per week. That's fairly stark data. I think the point that Christina was making was around how do we frame discussions? How do we start to have those discussions as health service providers, as family members, of members of community group? How do we actually begin to start to talk to people about use and misuse of alcohol? The SARE model was lovely, and I thought the Shorten Michigan alcoholism screening test was a very useful template as well. And of course, Dr. Helen McMonagall, who made the important point about it's about the quality of life, not about the quantity. It's about the onset of problem drinking happening under 50s. I really liked the concept of the library of your life and constantly replenishing that library, making sure that the shelves are full and regularly dusted, and that we're refreshing our memories, and that we're learning new things. And I thought the findings from the research about the low public awareness of the risk of thiamine deficiency and Wernicke's encephalopathy. I thought that was really fascinating, and very pleased that Healthy Ireland and Donegal County Council were supporting that work. So just in summary, I suppose the key points for me were we need to have programs that target older people specifically. A one-size-fits-all response is not going to work. There will be specific needs around comorbidity and social exclusion, social isolation for older people that may not affect younger people. And we also need to look at specifics around gender differences, and obviously the link between alcohol and dementia is so strong. We need to be getting that message out there. Including the positive aspects of that message, that 3 months of abstinence can lead to brain improvement. And we need to question ourselves when we are avoiding, or simply just, maybe not avoiding, but simply not having conversations with older people around alcohol. Is there an element of ageism there? Are we saying, look, what does it matter? You know, they've got so much else going on, how will they benefit? And if that is the case, we each need to question ourselves around our values and around whether there are aspects of ageism sneaking into our practice. From my own point of view, I'll be going back to the HSE and I'll be promoting these messages within the health and wellbeing function with our staff and across the MEC programme as well, the Making Every Contact Count, which is similar to your brief interventions and model that you were discussing there. The social prescribing role that's rolling out in the HSE, and also that we just recently got additional funding from Sláintecare for, I think is a really positive contribution that we can make to this, because social prescribing is about the very things that we were discussing about people living in isolated rural areas, having access to some form of social contact. And another message that I got out of today was the need for us to integrate the hospital and the community services more. Sláintecare is all about that, and there is a new structure, once again, for the HSE being developed, where the hospitals and the community health organisations will be more aligned in the future. So that can only be a good thing. But it's really, really important for our patients, clients, service users, that they are receiving the most appropriate care in the right setting, whether that's in a community setting with a GP, whether it's with a community physio or an OT, or whether it's in an acute hospital setting prior to discharge. We need to be, aligning our messages so everybody's singing from the same hymn sheet. And I suppose the last thing I'm just going to say is the title of the conference was Positive Aging, the Role of Alcohol. So I'm going to offer you each a challenge, should you choose to accept it, and that is to have one conversation over the weekend with somebody that you know. Start off small, have one conversation about alcohol, and see where that takes you, because we need to stop avoiding the significance of the problem and begin to address it. So, on that note, I'd like to conclude the conference. Thank you all for your participation, attention, and I believe lunch is served.